There are men who see the future clearly, who read the currents beneath the surface of history long before the storm arrives, and who are powerless to stop what they know is coming. Their tragedy is not ignorance. Their tragedy is understanding. Isoroku Yamamoto was such a man. He was the architect of the most audacious naval strike of the 20th century. He was also the man who spent years warning his own government, in rooms full of men who refused to listen, that executing that very strike would eventually destroy the nation he loved. He designed the opening act of a war he believed Japan could not win. He obeyed orders he had spent a career trying to prevent, and in the end, the same war machine he had helped build consumed him entirely, not on the deck of a battleship in some blaze of naval glory, but alone in the silence of a jungle he never should have been flying over. That contradiction between what a man knows and what a man does is what this documentary is about. We are going to move slowly tonight. There is no rush. If you have settled in, if the room is quiet, and the weight of the day is beginning to leave your body, then this is exactly the right moment to let this story find you. The history of the Second World War is full of names and dates and turning points. But underneath all of that machinery of conflict, there are human beings, complicated, contradictory, brilliant, and afraid. And Yamamoto is one of the most fascinating of all of them. We are going to follow his life from the beginning, from a small provincial town in Japan in the late 19th century, all the way to the cockpit of a crashed bomber in the jungle of Bougainville, and we are going to take our time doing it. So settle in. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told properly. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, a modest castle town on the island of Honshu that carried the particular melancholy of a place that had been on the wrong side of a war and had never quite finished grieving. The Meiji Restoration had remade Japan from the outside in, but in Nagaoka, the memory of samurai defeat was still fresh in the walls and the faces. He grew up poor, the last child of an aging schoolteacher, and the world he inherited was one already being rapidly dismantled and rebuilt in ways that no one fully understood yet. Japan was in the process of becoming something it had never been before, a modern industrial nation, hungry for recognition, determined to be taken seriously by the great powers of the world. Yamamoto grew up inside that hunger. It shaped everything he became. He was adopted at 16 into the Yamamoto family, a common enough practice in Meiji-era Japan, and one that gave him the name the world would come to know. He entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, where he distinguished himself in mathematics and strategy, and by the time he was a young officer, he had already been marked as someone different, someone whose mind operated at a level slightly above and slightly outside the thinking of his peers. He lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, the decisive naval engagement of the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan's fleet shattered the Russian Baltic Squadron in what became the defining military mythology of his entire generation. He carried those 2 missing fingers quietly for the rest of his life, a reminder, worn on his own hand, of how quickly the course of a battle can change. But here is what makes Yamamoto genuinely remarkable, what separates his story from the story of 100 other capable naval officers of his era. He went to America. In the early 1920s, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent him to Harvard University to study English and American economics, and those 2 years did something to him that cannot be easily undone. He did not simply sit in classrooms. He traveled. He went to Texas and stood at the edge of oil fields that stretched beyond the horizon. He visited automobile plants in Detroit, where thousands of workers built machines at a pace and a scale that Japan could not yet imagine matching. He watched the United States not as a tourist, but as a strategist, absorbing, calculating, understanding. And what he understood was this: America was not simply a large country. It was a productive engine of almost incomprehensible power, and if that engine were ever fully engaged in war, there was no naval force on Earth equipped to stop it. He brought that knowledge home with him. He spent the following 2 decades trying to make his own government understand it. He failed. Not for lack of trying, not for lack of clarity or courage. He said it plainly, to ministers and admirals and officials who had the power to change course. He opposed Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany. He opposed the march toward confrontation with Britain and the United States. He said, in terms that left no room for comfortable misunderstanding, that a war against America could not be won, not because Japan lacked bravery or skill, but because the arithmetic of industrial production would eventually grind any Japanese advantage into dust. He said it so plainly and so persistently that ultra-nationalist groups began to threaten his life. He received death threats. He was considered, in certain circles, something close to a traitor. And so, in 1939, the Japanese Navy did what bureaucracies do, with brilliant, inconvenient people. They promoted him. They gave him command of the combined fleet, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, and sent him to sea, away from the politics of Tokyo, partly to protect him and partly to silence him. The man most opposed to the coming war was handed the instruments of its opening. What he did with those instruments is the story we are about to tell. It moves from the drawing rooms of naval conferences in London to the flight decks of carriers, cutting through the winter North Pacific. It moves from the shock of Pearl Harbor on that Sunday morning in December of 1941 to the catastrophe of Midway 6 months later, where 4 of Japan's greatest carriers burned and sank in a single morning, and the strategic balance of the entire Pacific shifted in the space of hours. It moves through the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal, through a final desperate air offensive across the Solomon Islands, and finally to an intercept, a piece of decoded intelligence, a flight plan rendered into an ambush that ended everything. His is a story about the distance between wisdom and power, about what it costs a man to serve an institution he believes is leading his nation toward ruin, about how the clearest strategic thinker in a room can still be overruled by the room, and about how history sometimes chooses its most tragic figures, not from among the ignorant or the reckless, but from among those who saw everything coming and could not look away. If you are new here, please consider subscribing. These documentaries are made for exactly this kind of night. Long, unhurried, built for the hours when the world goes quiet and the mind is ready to receive something slow and serious and worth your attention. The story of Yamamoto is one of the great biographical narratives of the Second World War, and we are going to do it justice. The room is quiet, the night is yours. Let us begin in Nagaoka, in 1884, where a boy is born into a country that is still deciding what it wants to become. There is a town in the mountains of Niigata Prefecture where the snow falls early and stays long, where winter presses down on the rooftops with the particular weight of a place that has known hardship and learned to carry it without complaint. The town is called Nagaoka, and in the final decades of the 19th century, it wore its recent history the way a man wears a scar, visibly, quietly, without apology. The civil conflicts that had convulsed Japan in the late 1860s, the violent upheaval by which the old order of feudal lords and samurai retainers was swept aside to make room for the modernizing Meiji state, had passed through Nagaoka with exceptional brutality. The town had chosen the losing side. Its domain had fielded samurai soldiers against the imperial forces, had fought with genuine conviction, and had been crushed. The castle that once defined the skyline of Nagaoka was gone by the time the 1880s arrived, burned, dismantled, erased as thoroughly as the political order it had represented. Into this particular atmosphere of provincial pride and recent defeat, on the 4th of April, 1884, a boy named Isoroku Takano was born. His father, Sadayoshi Takano, was an aging man by the standards of the era, a former samurai retainer of the Nagaoka domain, who had outlived the world that gave his life its structure and meaning. The family was not destitute in any absolute sense, but they were poor in the way that men of former status are often poor. They had lineage where they needed income, memory where they needed resources, and pride where more practical commodities would have served better. The household into which Isoroku arrived was already burdened with several older children, and the addition of another mouth in lean circumstances was a fact to be absorbed rather than celebrated. The name given to the boy, Isoroku, meaning roughly 56 in an older form of the language, was a direct reflection of his father's age at the time of his birth. There was no sentimentality in it. It was a name that recorded a demographic fact, the way a ledger records a transaction, and it would follow the boy through a childhood shaped by scarcity and expectations of resilience. Nagaoka, in the 1880s, was a community still engaged in the complex emotional work of reconciling what it had been with what it was now required to become. The Meiji government, that had emerged from the upheaval of the previous decades, was not interested in nostalgia. It was building railroads, importing foreign expertise, remaking Japanese law and education and military organization along Western lines with a driven, almost desperate urgency. But in the provincial towns, the old consciousness survived in the textures of daily life, in the stories that older men told, in the particular way local families spoke of their ancestors, in the residual sense that Nagaoka had once been something distinct and had been made to pay for that distinction. For a boy growing up in this environment, the lessons absorbed were not primarily academic. They were lessons about loyalty to a community, about endurance in the face of circumstances one cannot alter, about the relationship between honor and loss. These were not lessons delivered formally. They were simply the weather of the place. The young Isoroku was, by most accounts drawn from those who knew him, a serious child, not joyless, but serious, in the way that children become serious when the conditions of their lives do not permit prolonged frivolity. He was physically energetic and mentally alert, drawn toward problems that had logical solutions, and capable of a focused concentration that impressed his teachers. Mathematics, in particular, seemed to offer him something that the uncertain world around him could not, a domain where effort reliably produced correct answers, where the rules did not change depending on who had won or lost the last war. This affinity for precision and numerical reasoning would follow him into adulthood and eventually into the highest levels of naval strategy, where his ability to hold complex variables in mind simultaneously would become one of his defining professional traits. But in the schoolrooms of Nagaoka, in the late 1880s and early 1890s, it was simply the quality of a boy who liked to know that he had gotten the right answer. The world beyond Nagaoka was, during these years, changing with a velocity that no previous generation of Japanese people had been asked to absorb. The Meiji government's program of modernization was reshaping not just institutions but identities, what it meant to be Japanese, what it meant to be loyal, what forms of ambition were now possible for a young man of modest origin and serious mind. The military, in particular, had been transformed. The old samurai class had been formally abolished, conscript armies built in its place, and new military academies established to train officers on Western models for a military that now thought of itself in genuinely modern terms. For a boy of Isoroku's background, the son of a former samurai retainer in a domain that had lost everything, the military academies represented something specific. They represented a path, not simply a career, but a way of converting the inheritance of defeat into something that might yet yield distinction. It was in this spirit, or something close to it, that Isoroku Takano made his way toward the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, the island institution in Hiroshima Bay that trained the officers of Japan's rapidly expanding fleet. But before that next chapter fully opens, there is one more transformation to record, one that altered not his prospects, but his name, and therefore, in the logic of the culture he inhabited, something close to his identity. At the age of 16, Isoroku was formally adopted into the Yamamoto family. The practice of adoption in Meiji Japan served a range of practical social purposes. Families without male heirs might adopt a promising young man to carry forward a family name. And for young men of limited means, adoption into a family of even modest standing could provide the social footing that birth alone had not. The Yamamoto family of Nagaoka was one such household, an old local family whose line required continuation. The adoption was, in its way, a transaction. But transactions, in this cultural context, carried genuine weight. To take a family name was to take on obligations. To ancestors, to the living members of that family, to the name itself, and what it represented in the community. Isoroku Takano became Isoroku Yamamoto, and the boy who had grown up carrying the name of his father's age now carried instead the name of a Nagaoka family lineage. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because the name Yamamoto would eventually become one of the most recognizable in the history of the Pacific War, spoken in admiration, in anger, in sorrow, in strategic calculation, by men on opposite sides of an ocean. None of that was visible in 1900, when the adoption was formalized. There was only a 16-year-old boy in a provincial town, acquiring a new name, with the particular mixture of solemnity and practicality that characterized so much of Meiji-era life. What did Nagaoka make of Isoroku Yamamoto? It made him local before it made him national. It made him someone who understood loss before he understood triumph. It placed in him a pride that was not the easy pride of inherited success, but the harder, more durable pride of a community that had been beaten and had continued anyway. The samurai tradition that his father had embodied was formally dead as a social institution, but it was not dead in the sense that the values associated with it, discipline, directness, the subordination of personal comfort to collective obligation, had simply evaporated. They had migrated. They had found new containers in the academies and the military, and the ethic of national service that the Meiji state was actively cultivating, and they lived on in the households and classrooms and conversation of towns like Nagaoka, where living memory of the old world had not yet fully faded. There is a detail from Yamamoto's childhood that recurs in accounts of his early years, small enough to be easily overlooked and precise enough to be worth holding. The town of Nagaoka had a tradition, a local cultural practice of stubborn, almost defiant frugality that its residents wore as a badge of identity long after economic necessity might have made it optional. The tradition held that simplicity was honorable, that extravagance was not merely wasteful, but morally suspect, that a person's worth was measured in endurance and in contribution rather than in display. Whether young Isoroku would have articulated any of this in those terms is unknowable, but the ethic embedded itself in him in ways that his later colleagues and subordinates would observe and remark upon. in the plainness of his personal habits, in the directness of his manner, in the way he seemed genuinely indifferent to comfort and genuinely attentive to capability. The Pacific Ocean was, from Nagaoka, an almost abstract concept, a vast body of water somewhere beyond the mountains and the coast, and the long distances that separated an inland provincial town from the edges of an island nation, still orienting itself toward the world beyond its shores. Isoroku Yamamoto, in his earliest years, had no particular relationship with the sea. The sea was not part of the immediate texture of his childhood, the way the snow was, or the memory of the castle, or the stories of the men who had fought and lost a generation before he was born. The sea would come later, through the academy, through training, through a career that would eventually carry him to the furthest reaches of the ocean he had once scarcely imagined. But it is worth noting the distance between the boy and the water, because it serves as a reminder that the great naval strategist of the Pacific War did not emerge fully formed from a maritime birthright. He was shaped first by mountains and poverty and defeat, and the stubborn pride of a community that had chosen the wrong side and survived anyway. The 1880s are long gone now. The castle town of Nagaoka has been rebuilt and rebuilt again, surviving the destruction of the Second World War and the passage of more than a century beyond the life of its most famous son. But something of the atmosphere of that place and that era, the particular combination of local pride, material constraint, historical wound, and forward-looking seriousness, seems to have settled permanently into the character of the boy who was born there in the early spring of 1884. He would leave Nagaoka. He would travel to the other side of the world and back. He would rise to command the greatest naval force Japan had ever assembled. And through all of it, something of the provincial samurai town where he had learned to be serious before he learned to be ambitious would remain in him, shaping his judgments, informing his silences, giving him the particular quality of stillness that those who knew him would later struggle to fully describe. He was Isoroku Yamamoto. He had just turned 16, and somewhere ahead of him, past the academy and the war games and the great debates about battleships and aircraft carriers, and the terrible arithmetic of industrial capacity, the Pacific waited. The island of Etajima sits in the sheltered waters of Hiroshima Bay, close enough to the mainland to feel connected to Japan's beating heart, yet separated by just enough water to feel like another world entirely. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy had been established there in the 1880s, and by the time a young man from Nagaoka arrived to begin his training, it had already hardened into an institution of formidable seriousness. Its buildings were brick and stone, its routines were severe, and its purpose was singular: to transform the sons of Japan into the officers of its rising maritime power. The cadets who passed through its gates did not merely study naval warfare. They were shaped by it, physically and psychologically, until the sea and the service became inseparable from their sense of self. For Isoroku Takano, newly adopted into the Yamamoto family and carrying the weight of a borrowed name, this environment was not a burden. It was, in some deep sense, exactly what he had been waiting for. The Academy's curriculum was demanding across every dimension: seamanship, gunnery, navigation, engineering, and the tactical theory of fleet engagements, drawn from centuries of naval history. But it was in mathematics and strategic reasoning that the young cadet from Nagaoka distinguished himself most clearly. Those who trained alongside him would later recall a mind that moved with unusual precision, a student who did not merely absorb problems, but seemed to inhabit them, turning them over, examining the angles, arriving at solutions that others had overlooked. This was not the performance of a natural genius. performing effortlessly for an audience. It was the product of genuine application, the kind of focused discipline that Nagaoka had already begun to build in him. The poverty and austerity of his upbringing had given him a threshold for difficulty that many of his classmates, from more comfortable origins, simply did not possess. At Etajima, that threshold was an advantage. The physical demands of the academy were equally unforgiving. Swimming in cold water, extended drills, the kind of deliberate hardship that institutions of that era believed separated the worthy from the unworthy, all of it was absorbed and met without complaint. Yamamoto was not a large man. He was compact, precise in his movements, with an intensity in his expression that those around him noticed and rarely forgot. The academy placed enormous value on composure under pressure, on the officer's ability to project calm when circumstances were anything but calm. This, too, suited him. The boy who had grown up among the embers of samurai defeat in Nagaoka had learned something about how to carry loss without being visibly diminished by it. That lesson would serve him in ways neither he nor anyone around him could yet anticipate. He graduated and received his commission in the years just before the Great Test came. The Russo-Japanese War, which broke out in the early months of 1904, was unlike anything Japan had previously attempted on the world stage. It was a war against a European great power, the Russian Empire, fought simultaneously on land in Manchuria and at sea across the waters of the Pacific and the straits of Northeast Asia. The naval dimension of the conflict would prove decisive, and for the young officer who had trained so rigorously at Etajima, it would provide the defining experience of his early military life. He was assigned to a cruiser operating within the combined fleet under Admiral Haihachiro Togo, a commander whose name was already spoken with reverence throughout the Japanese Navy. The campaign at sea built steadily through the months of 1904, with Japanese naval forces working to contain and then destroy the Russian Pacific Squadron based at Port Arthur. When that squadron was finally neutralized, the war's naval calculus shifted to the second great Russian fleet, the Baltic Squadron, which had been ordered to sail from the far side of the world on an extraordinary voyage of roughly 18,000 nautical miles to reach the theater of conflict. This fleet, under Admiral Rozhestvensky, was exhausted, mechanically strained, and fundamentally ill-prepared for what awaited it by the time it entered the Korea Strait in the late spring of 1905. What awaited it was Togo's fleet. What followed was the Battle of Tsushima. In the annals of naval history, or rather, in the long record of naval warfare that strategists and historians would study for generations, Tsushima holds a particular position of finality. It was not a close-fought engagement. It was closer to an annihilation. Togo's famous maneuver, the crossing of the Russian fleet's head at the opening of the battle, placed the Japanese fleet in an almost textbook position of tactical dominance, and the Russian squadron, disoriented, outgunned in effective terms, and unable to close the range on its own terms, was destroyed over the course of a day and a night of fighting. By the time the guns fell silent, the Russian fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. 2 Russian battleships surrendered. The flagship had been sunk. The Japanese Navy had lost a handful of torpedo boats. It was one of the most lopsided, decisive engagements in the history of modern naval warfare. For the young officer from Nagaoka, Tsushima was both a triumph and a wound. He fought in the battle, and somewhere in the violence of that engagement, in the concussion and chaos of heavy guns exchanged at close range, he lost 2 fingers on his left hand. The historical record does not linger on the precise moment or the exact circumstances, and Yamamoto himself never made the injury a subject of elaboration. He carried it quietly, The way men of that training and that background carried most things, inwardly, without display, as though drawing attention to it would somehow diminish what the battle had meant in a larger sense. In the years that followed, those missing fingers became a physical detail that those who met him tended to notice and then never quite forget. It was the smallest visible mark of a battle that had shaped an entire generation's understanding of what naval warfare could accomplish. The mythology that Tsushima immediately began to generate inside Japan's naval culture was profound and, in certain ways, eventually dangerous. The lesson most officers drew from the battle was this: that a well-prepared Japanese fleet, fighting at the right moment and in the right position, could achieve total destruction of an enemy fleet in a single decisive engagement. The concept of the decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, did not begin at Tsushima, but Tsushima gave it the force of lived experience and apparent historical proof. If it could happen once, it could happen again. The entire structure of Japanese naval strategy in the decades that followed would be built with increasing rigidity around the expectation that the next great war at sea would also be decided in a single, overwhelming clash. Yamamoto absorbed this mythology along with everyone else. The difference, though it would take years to become fully visible, was that he also began, slowly and instinctively, to question it. There is something worth sitting with here, in the gap between what Tsushima proved and what it was understood to prove. What it actually demonstrated was the destruction of a fleet that had already been defeated in every meaningful sense before the first gun was fired, exhausted by an impossible voyage, operating far from any support, in waters dominated by the enemy. The conditions that produced such a one-sided outcome were extraordinary. They were not, in any realistic reading, reproducible on demand. But the officers who had stood on the decks of Togo's fleet and watched the Russian ships go down did not, by and large, draw that more cautious conclusion. Victory at that scale tends to teach its own lesson, and the lesson tends to be, we are capable of this. The young Yamamoto, standing among them, was not yet in a position to argue otherwise. That argument would come later, and it would cost him considerably when it did. What Tsushima gave him beyond doctrine was something harder to measure and perhaps more important: a direct, unmediated understanding of what naval combat actually felt like from inside it. Not the diagrams and calculations of Etajima, but the real texture of engagement, the noise, the physical danger, the irreversibility of decisions made under pressure with incomplete information. He had been tested, and he had come through it, and he had left 2 pieces of himself in those waters as evidence. This kind of knowledge cannot be taught in any academy. It can only be earned, and its price varies. For many of the men around him, Tsushima remained forever a story of triumph to be remembered and celebrated. For Yamamoto, it also remained something else, a reminder of what war actually costs, even when the outcome is decisive, even when the flags are flying and the numbers are overwhelmingly in your favor. He returned from that war as a decorated junior officer with a wound that would not heal in the sense of disappearing, a strategic mythology burned into his generation's collective understanding, and a set of questions already beginning to form at the edges of everything he had been taught. Etajima had shaped him, Tsushima had tested him, and the decades ahead would demand of him something that neither institution had specifically prepared him for: the capacity to hold his own best judgment against the current of an entire naval culture that had decided, long before he rose high enough to matter, what victory looked like and how it would be achieved. The 2 missing fingers would be visible in every meeting, every briefing, every moment of command. They were a reminder that he had been there, that he knew something real, that what was at stake in naval warfare was not abstract. That knowledge was his to carry, and carry it he did, quietly, precisely, and for the rest of his life. He arrived in America carrying almost nothing that could prepare him for what he was about to see. The year was 1921, and Isoroku Yamamoto, naval officer, survivor of Tsushima, newly promoted and quietly formidable, stepped onto American soil, not as an adversary, not yet as a legend, but as a student. He had been assigned by the Imperial Japanese Navy to study at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with instructions to improve his English and deepen his understanding of American economics. The assignment carried the dry, bureaucratic tone of an administrative posting. What it actually represented was something far rarer: 2 full years inside the engine room of the country that Japan's naval planners had long treated as a theoretical opponent, but rarely troubled to understand. Yamamoto would come to understand it better than almost any officer in the Japanese fleet, and that understanding would mark him for the rest of his life as a man out of step with the world around him. The knowledge he brought home from America was not comfort. It was a weight he would carry quietly, like those 2 missing fingers on his left hand, every day until he died. Cambridge, in the early 1920s, was a world of ideas and argument, a place where men from dozens of countries sat in the same lecture halls and argued about money, markets, production, and the shifting tectonic plates of the post-war international order. For Yamamoto, whose formation had been almost entirely military, the academic environment offered something genuinely disorienting: an insistence that power was not simply a matter of battleships and fighting men, but of coal and steel and capital and logistics and the sheer compounding weight of national output over years and decades. He had already shown, in his years at Etajima and in the careful self-education of a serious officer, that he could think across disciplines. Here, the discipline he was forced to think across was economics, and it did not let him look away. He was a diligent student, reportedly working on his English with the same methodical intensity he had once applied to navigation tables, determined to be fluent enough to read not just official documents, but newspapers, business reports, the ordinary texture of American life as it described itself in print. But it was not the university that taught him the most. It was the country itself. Yamamoto traveled widely across the United States during his time there, with a curiosity that was neither casual nor touristic. He moved with the attentiveness of a man conducting reconnaissance, not in any clandestine sense, but in the sense that everything he saw was being weighed, measured, and filed against the strategic questions that never fully left him, even when he was far from any naval headquarters. He went south to Texas, where oil fields stretched across the flat earth in numbers that strained easy comprehension, machinery hammering at the ground day and night, drawing up the fuel on which modern war, modern everything, had come absolutely to depend. He watched the scale of it with the sober eye of someone who already knew that Japan's home islands produced almost no oil of their own, that every liter of fuel that moved a Japanese warship through the Pacific came from somewhere else, and that the somewhere else was, in many critical respects, the United States itself, or controlled by American commercial interests. The oil fields of Texas were not just an economic curiosity. They were a strategic fact of almost terrifying clarity. He went to Detroit, which in the early 1920s was the most extraordinary industrial city on the planet, a place where the logic of mass production had been taken to its furthest extension and had transformed not just the automobile industry, but the entire concept of what organized manufacture could accomplish in a compressed period of time. He walked through plants where vehicles came together on moving lines, with a precision and speed that had no equivalent anywhere in Asia, where the relationship between raw material, machine tool, and finished product had been compressed into something close to a continuous flow. He watched American workers, American machinery, and American organizational systems operating at a scale that Japanese industrial planners in 1921 could only begin to approach. What struck him most, those who knew him recalled, was not the machinery itself, but the underlying architecture of it, the way American industry had been designed from its foundations to expand, to replicate, to produce not dozens or hundreds of units, but tens of thousands, and to do so reliably, repeatedly, and at increasing pace. In a war measured by productive capacity over time, this was not an advantage. It was a different category of reality entirely. He was also watching American culture, American society, American geography. He traveled enough of the country to feel the sheer physical scale of it. A continental nation of enormous distances and enormous resources, with a population that was not merely large but growing, diverse, and animated by an economic confidence that expressed itself in construction, in movement, in the visible accumulation of wealth at every level of society. He attended baseball games. He played poker, reportedly with genuine skill and enjoyment. He sat with Americans, in ways that his countrymen at home rarely did, listened to how they spoke about their country, their future, their assumptions about what America was, and where it was going. He found many things to admire and some things to find baffling, as any thoughtful person does when immersed in a genuinely foreign culture. But the cumulative impression was not bafflement, it was respect, and something deeper than respect, a reckoning. He was calculating what a war between this country and his own would actually look like, not in terms of opening engagements or tactical maneuver, but in terms of years, in terms of production curves and supply chains, and the grinding arithmetic of national will sustained over time. The conclusion he reached was neither complicated nor comforting. Japan could not win such a war, not in any meaningful, lasting sense. A sudden blow might create conditions for a negotiated settlement. That argument would come later, in different rooms and different years. But a sustained conflict between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the full industrial mobilization of the United States was not a war Japan could survive. He did not arrive at this conclusion, reluctantly, or with any particular ideological motive. He arrived at it the way an engineer arrives at a structural calculation, by measuring what was there and following the numbers to where they led. The numbers led somewhere that the officers back home, studying their fleet ratios and their torpedo data, were not prepared to go. He returned to Japan in 1923, changed in ways that were not visible on the surface, but ran through everything that came after. His English was now genuinely functional. He could read American publications and follow conversations and debates in a language that most of his colleagues treated as irrelevant or secondary. His understanding of American industrial capacity was not theoretical, but had been grounded in physical, witnessed reality, and his conviction about the consequences of conflict had moved from an instinct to something closer to an established fact in his own mind. He would spend the next 18 years trying to translate that fact into policy, into restraint, into treaty frameworks and diplomatic caution, and eventually into outright opposition to the military alliance with Germany and the push toward war. He would fail, incrementally and then completely, as the institutional momentum of the Japanese military machine overrode every argument he could make. But he would never stop making the arguments, and he would never stop knowing, in the quiet certainty that his time in America had built into him exactly what the failure of those arguments would eventually cost. There is something almost unbearable in the image of him as a student in Cambridge, walking through an autumn in New England, already carrying the knowledge that would define his tragedy. He was, in those years, not yet the great admiral of Japanese mythology, not yet the architect of Pearl Harbor or the broken man of Midway. He was simply a naval officer with sharp eyes and a serious mind, doing what he had been sent to do, learning about America. The problem was that he learned too well. He came home with an accurate picture of the country his nation was moving toward collision with, and accuracy in that particular moment was not an asset that the Japanese military establishment was equipped to reward. The men who would eventually send him to war against the United States were the men who had never taken the trouble to see it clearly. He had seen it clearly. He had walked its oil fields and stood on its factory floors and played poker in its parlors and felt the weight of its productive power settle into his understanding, like a stone settling into deep water. That stone never moved. It sat there through every conference, every promotion, every diplomatic battle, every anguished private warning delivered in rooms that had already made up their minds. It sat there when he planned the strike on Pearl Harbor, and it sat there when the reports came back that the American carriers had not been in port. He knew, before anyone else in the fleet was ready to admit it, that the country he had spent 2 years trying to understand had just been given the time it needed to do exactly what he had seen it was capable of doing. The war had started. The clock he had watched being wound in Detroit and Texas and the corridors of Harvard had begun to run. He came home from America, a changed man. Not outwardly. He still carried himself with the compact, deliberate bearing that his years at Etajima had pressed into his posture like a crease in cloth. But inwardly, something had shifted, quietly and permanently. The United States had done what no single lecture or naval briefing ever could. It had shown him scale. The oil fields, the assembly lines, the continental distances between one city and the next, all of it had imprinted on him a picture of industrial power that Japan's naval establishment had not yet fully reckoned with. He returned to a navy, still in love with its own mythology, still reading the Battle of Tsushima like a scripture, still placing the battleship at the center of every serious conversation about sea power. Yamamoto had read that scripture too. He simply no longer believed it told the whole story. The battleship orthodoxy he returned to was not a fringe position held by a few stubborn old admirals. It was the doctrine of an entire institution, woven into procurement decisions, promotion pathways, and the deepest professional loyalties of the men who ran the Imperial Japanese Navy. The great gun, the armored hull, the line of battle, these were the instruments through which Japan had humiliated the Russian fleet in the Tsushima Strait, and the memory of that morning in 1905 was still vivid enough to govern thinking 2 decades later. To suggest that the future of naval warfare lay not in the gun turret, but in the flight deck, was not merely an unorthodox technical opinion. It was, to many senior officers, something close to professional heresy. Yamamoto understood this. He moved carefully at first, watching, reading, calculating the resistance he would face before he committed himself fully to the argument. What turned calculation into conviction was flight. At an age when most naval officers of his seniority had long since left physical risk to younger men, Yamamoto applied for pilot training. He was in his late 30s, well past the age at which the body adapts most readily to the demands of aviation, and his instructors would have known exactly who he was, a rising officer who had no practical need to sit in the cockpit of an aircraft. He sat there anyway. The experience was not romantic in the way it might have been for a younger man encountering speed and altitude for the first time. For Yamamoto, it was analytical, purposeful, and in its own way ruthless. He needed to understand what an aircraft could and could not do, not from a briefing document, but from his hands and his body, and the particular clarity that comes only from personal exposure to a thing's real demands. He learned enough to trust his own judgment about what air power could achieve. That judgment would define the rest of his career. His posting to the Kasumigara Naval Air Corps gave him the institutional footing he needed. Kasumigara sat on the broad inland lake northeast of Tokyo, a flat and misty expanse of water that had served as one of the Navy's primary aviation training grounds since the early 1920s. Here, away from the political gravity of the Naval General Staff, Yamamoto could work. He threw himself into the detail: training schedules, aircraft performance envelopes, the mathematics of range and payload, and the logistics of operating aircraft at sea rather than from a fixed shore installation. He was not content to administer from a distance. He watched pilots train. He studied failure as carefully as success. He accumulated, over months and then years, a precise and practical understanding of what a naval air arm required to function at the highest level, and what it required to survive in combat against a serious opponent. Kasumigara shaped him as a commander in ways that no amount of strategic theorizing ever could have. It was during this period that his thinking about the aircraft carrier began to crystallize into something more than a general preference for air power. The carrier, as Yamamoto came to understand it, was not simply a ship that launched aeroplanes. It was a mobile, offensive weapons system of a fundamentally different kind, one that could project striking power across distances that no battleship could reach, against targets that no battleship could find. The gun had range measured in tens of kilometers. The aircraft had range measured in hundreds. A fleet built around carriers could choose its engagement, could strike without itself being struck, could operate across a vast maritime geography in ways that the line of battle doctrine simply could not accommodate. This was not an abstract theoretical preference. It was, in Yamamoto's view, a sober and practical assessment of what naval warfare was going to look like in the decades ahead, whether Japan embraced that reality or not. The resistance he faced from within the Naval General Staff was substantial and sometimes openly contemptuous. The senior admirals who had built their careers on battleship doctrine were not men who questioned their own foundational assumptions easily. Some dismissed air power as a useful supplement, reconnaissance perhaps, or light harassment of enemy formations, but not as the primary instrument of fleet combat. Others raised the practical objections. Aircraft were fragile. Pilots were difficult to train in sufficient numbers. The logistics of carrier operations at sea were complex and vulnerable. These were not entirely unreasonable points. Yamamoto acknowledged the difficulties. What he would not do was allow practical difficulty to become a permanent excuse for strategic immobility. He pressed his argument through every available channel, in formal papers, in staff discussions, in the patient and sometimes blunt conversations with colleagues that were the real currency of institutional change in any military organization. He was not arguing alone. Around him, a generation of younger officers had also been watching the development of naval aviation with serious professional interest, and Yamamoto became something of a pole star for those who shared his conviction. His seniority gave the argument credibility it might not otherwise have had from junior advocates alone. His willingness to learn to fly, to put his own body into the machine he was advocating for, gave him a moral authority that was harder to dismiss than any paper he could have written. When an officer of his rank and experience said that carrier aviation was the future of naval warfare, it could not be waved away as the enthusiasm of someone who had never seen the reality of combat. Yamamoto had lost 2 fingers at Tsushima. He knew what combat cost. The broader institutional climate of the Japanese Navy in the 1920s and early 1930s was not entirely hostile to innovation. The service had always prided itself on a willingness to learn from foreign navies. It had, after all, been built largely on the model of the Royal Navy, and its victories had come partly from a rigorous adoption of the best available technology and doctrine. But there was a crucial distinction between adopting well-proven foreign innovations and staking the entire future of Japanese naval power on an unproven doctrine that contradicted the lessons every senior admiral had spent his career absorbing. Yamamoto was asking the institution to bet on a future it could not yet fully see. That kind of institutional leap requires either catastrophic proof that the old way has failed, or a figure with enough standing and enough persistence to shift the center of gravity before the catastrophe arrives. Yamamoto was trying to be that figure. His years at Kasumigaura and the assignments that followed it placed him in a position to shape both procurement decisions and the training culture of Japanese naval aviation. These were the two levers that actually determined what a navy could do in war. Not the papers that circulated through the general staff, but the aircraft that were ordered and the pilots who were trained to fly them. In both areas, Yamamoto pushed for quality and for range. He wanted aircraft that could fly farther, strike harder, and be operated by crews trained to a standard of precision that the battleship navy had never needed to develop. The culture he was trying to build was demanding almost to the point of severity. Pilots trained under the standards he championed were expected to achieve levels of accuracy and endurance that pushed against the limits of what human beings and their machines could sustain. It was a culture that would eventually produce some of the finest naval aviators in the world, and one whose costs, in terms of the sheer time required to produce each trained flyer, would become devastating when attrition began to bite. The tension between Yamamoto and the conservative admirals never fully resolved itself into open confrontation during these years. The Japanese naval culture was not one in which direct personal conflict between officers of senior rank was conducted publicly or without consequence. The disagreements were real, but they were managed through the careful, face-preserving protocols that governed every serious professional relationship in the service. What Yamamoto achieved was not a decisive defeat of the battleship orthodoxy. The great guns never lost their institutional advocates, and the colossal battleships that Japan would eventually build stood as physical monuments to the persistence of the old faith. What he achieved was a parallel track, a carrier doctrine, an air arm, a cadre of trained aviators, and a body of operational thinking that would eventually make possible operations that no purely battleship navy could have contemplated. By the time he moved into the senior command roles that would define his public reputation, Yamamoto had spent more than a decade pressing this argument through every means available to him. He had accumulated not just a set of ideas about how naval warfare was changing, but a practical record of having built something real: training programs, operational concepts, institutional relationships with the men who flew and maintained and commanded aircraft at sea. He was no longer simply an advocate. He was, by any serious measure, one of the principal architects of Japanese carrier power. The irony that this power would one day be turned against the United States, the country whose industrial enormity had first taught him why such a war could not ultimately be won, was not lost on him. He was building the instrument of a gamble he believed, in the deepest part of his judgment, was doomed. But he built it as well as he could, because if the gamble was going to be taken regardless, the only responsible thing left to do was to give it the best possible chance of succeeding. London, 1930. The city carried itself with the quiet confidence of an empire that had not yet fully reckoned with its own exhaustion. The Great War had ended barely a decade before, and the capitals of Europe and the wider world were still trying to calculate what it had cost them, in treasure, in men, in the certainty that civilization moved only forward. It was into this atmosphere of cautious diplomacy and fragile hope that a Japanese naval officer arrived, carrying a briefcase, a sharp analytical mind, and a private conviction that the alternative to negotiation was ruin. Isoroku Yamamoto had by this point already distinguished himself as an unconventional thinker within a service that rewarded conformity. He had studied in America, flown aircraft, and watched with growing unease as the admirals around him measured national greatness in the displacement tonnage of battleships. Now he was in London, seated at a conference table with the representatives of the United States and Great Britain, tasked with finding a framework that might, if the right compromises could be struck, slow the drift toward a naval arms race that no one in the room could truly afford. The London Naval Conference of 1930 was in many ways a continuation of what had begun at Washington in 1922, when the major powers had agreed to place limits on battleship construction in a ratio system that assigned Japan a smaller allowance than the United States or Britain. That ratio, 5 to 5 to 3, had never sat easily with the Japanese Navy. The institutional pride of a service that had annihilated the Russian fleet at Tsushima barely 2 decades earlier did not bend gracefully toward arithmetic imposed at a foreign table. Yamamoto understood the psychology of his institution, even as he worked against its worst impulses. He could feel the resentment in the Japanese delegation, the belief that Japan was being treated as a lesser power, a regional navy rather than a global one, by countries that had no intention of fighting their next war in the Western Pacific. What Yamamoto grasped, and what many of his colleagues refused to grant, was that the ratio was not an insult. It was a ceiling that also constrained the powers above it, and a ceiling on American and British construction was, for Japan, a form of protection. His arguments in London were patient and precise. He was not there to capitulate, and he knew the domestic political cost of returning to Tokyo with nothing. But he pushed, within the room and in private conversation, for arrangements that would extend and strengthen the existing framework, that would bind the naval powers to mutual restraint before the shipyards had a chance to render restraint impossible. He engaged his counterparts with a directness that surprised some of them. He spoke English well enough to negotiate its nuances, to sense the gap between what a diplomat said and what he meant, and he used that fluency strategically. Those who sat across from him in London came away with the impression of a man who was serious in a way that transcended national role-playing, a man who actually wanted the conference to succeed, not merely to produce a document that could be presented at home as a success. Whether that sincerity was enough was another matter. The conference produced a treaty, but it was a treaty that creaked under the weight of competing demands. Japan won some concessions in the categories of cruisers and submarines, and the delegation returned to Tokyo, able to claim partial progress. But back in Japan, partial progress was already beginning to look like surrender. The militarist press attacked the agreement. Naval officers, who had opposed the arms limitation framework from the beginning, used the conference outcome as proof that diplomacy with the Western powers was a slow form of national humiliation. Yamamoto watched this reaction with the particular frustration of a man who has fought for something reasonable and watched it be denounced as weakness. He had not abandoned Japan's interests in London. He had attempted to serve them through means that required patience rather than confrontation. The audience for that argument was shrinking. The years between the two London conferences were years of acceleration, not toward war, not yet, but toward the conditions that make war feel inevitable. Japan had seized Manchuria in 1931, an act that revealed the growing independence of military factions from civilian oversight, and that strained Japan's relationships with the Western powers irreparably. The League of Nations condemned the action. Japan walked out of the League. Within the Navy, the moderate internationalist camp to which Yamamoto broadly belonged was losing ground to a faction that viewed the Washington Treaty System as a strategic cage built by rivals who feared Japanese power. The argument was emotionally potent and factually crude, and it was winning. Yamamoto continued to advance through the naval hierarchy, continued to argue his positions in the rooms where such arguments were still permitted, but the rooms were getting smaller and the arguments were getting less welcome. By 1934, when Yamamoto returned to London as the leader of Japan's delegation to the Second Naval Conference, the political weather had changed entirely. He was not arriving to negotiate. He was arriving, in essence, to deliver a verdict. The Japanese government had already determined that it would not accept the continuation of the ratio system, and if the Western powers would not agree to full naval parity, to a system of equal limits rather than proportional ones, Japan would leave the treaty framework altogether. Yamamoto personally may have hoped, even at this late stage, that some formula might emerge that would preserve the structure of arms limitation. But he was a representative of a state whose direction of travel was no longer primarily his to influence. He argued for parity because he had been instructed to argue for parity, and because parity was a more defensible position than withdrawal. He knew before the talks concluded what the outcome would be. The British and Americans would not concede parity. From their perspective, the ratio system had served its purpose. It had limited their own construction costs, while maintaining a comfortable advantage in overall naval strength. To accept equal limits was to accept that Japan had an equal right to project naval power across the Pacific and into the oceans that Britain and the United States considered their own strategic domain. That was not a concession either power was prepared to make in 1934, and the refusal was not unreasonable on its own terms. But the consequences of refusing were not fully weighed. When Yamamoto rose to announce Japan's intention to withdraw from the treaty system, when it expired at the end of 1936, he was doing so as the most visible face of a decision that would remove the last formal constraint on Japanese naval construction. He was the instrument of the outcome he had spent years working to prevent. The walkout of the conference was measured and formal, the language of diplomacy, applied to the act of ending diplomacy. Yamamoto conducted it without theatre, without the kind of performative nationalism that would have played well back home. Those who observed him in those final sessions noted a quality that was difficult to name precisely. Not regret exactly, not defeat, but something like the composure of a man absorbing a blow he had seen coming long enough to prepare for it. He had made the arguments. He had made them carefully and repeatedly, and in good faith. They had not prevailed. There was nothing more in London for him to do, except close the door quietly and return to Japan to face what came next. What came next was the collapse of the treaty framework and the beginning of an unconstrained naval buildup that would consume Japanese industrial capacity for the remainder of the decade. The battleship admirals, freed from the ratios they had always resented, moved quickly. Design work accelerated on the enormous warships that would become the Yamato and the Musashi, vessels of extraordinary size and cost, the largest battleships ever built, representing a philosophy of warfare that Yamamoto was already arguing was obsolete. He watched the construction programs advance with the mixture of frustration and professional admiration that he brought to most things he disagreed with. The ships were marvels of engineering. He simply believed that the next great naval battle would not be fought by ships of that kind, and that the steel and labor pouring into their hulls would have been better spent on aircraft carriers and the men who flew from them. Behind all of this ran a political struggle that was increasingly difficult to fight openly. The militarist factions that had captured the army and were steadily colonizing the government's foreign policy machinery were not simply bureaucratic rivals. They were, by the mid-1930s, capable of political violence, and men who opposed their program too publicly had learned to be careful. Yamamoto was not physically intimidated easily, and he was not the kind of man who softened his private views to match the room. But he was also not foolish about the limits of individual dissent inside an institution that valued hierarchy and consensus. He had allies, and he used them. He had access to ministers and senior officials, and he used that access. He said, in private conversations that were sometimes repeated and sometimes not, that Japan's industrial and economic base could not sustain a long war against the United States, that the Washington treaties had actually served Japanese interests by constraining American construction, and that the policy Japan was now pursuing would lead somewhere none of them wanted to go. None of it changed the course. The men who needed to be persuaded were not persuadable, or they were persuadable but not powerful, or they were powerful but not willing to pay the price that open dissent now carried. Yamamoto left London for the last time in 1934, carrying the knowledge of what he had failed to prevent and the responsibility of serving a government whose direction he privately opposed. He was not broken by this. He was not the kind of man who broke easily. But something had been confirmed in him in those conference rooms, a certainty about where Japan was heading that would harden over the next several years into the specific and terrible calculations of a man preparing for a war he did not want and could not stop. By the late 1930s, Japan was accelerating toward a collision that many of its own military leaders privately feared and publicly endorsed. The militarist factions that had spent a decade tightening their grip on the government had found their moment, and dissent, even within the senior ranks, was becoming a genuinely dangerous posture. It was in this atmosphere, charged with nationalist fervor and quiet intimidation, that Isoroku Yamamoto chose to speak, not in whispers, not in the careful bureaucratic language of men protecting their careers, but plainly, directly, and at considerable personal risk. He had spent 2 years at Harvard. He had driven through Texas oil fields and walked the floors of Detroit assembly plants. He had seen what American industrial civilization could produce when it was roused, and that memory sat in him like a stone he could not set down. What he had witnessed in America was not merely impressive. It was, in his private calculus, the measure of Japan's potential destruction. His opposition to the Tripartite Pact, the alliance being negotiated between Japan, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy, was not a subtle or deniable position. He expressed it to cabinet ministers, to fellow officers, and in the corridors of the Navy Ministry, with a bluntness that alarmed those around him. The pact, in his view, was not a shield, but a provocation, one that would bind Japan to the fate of powers whose ambitions he did not share and whose staying power he did not trust. An alliance with Germany, he argued, would do nothing to solve Japan's actual strategic problem, which was its dependence on imported oil, iron, and raw materials that the United States could cut off at any moment it chose. Worse, it would signal to Washington and London that Japan had chosen its side, foreclosing the diplomatic space in which a negotiated accommodation might still, just barely, be possible. His colleagues listened. Some agreed privately. Fewer said so aloud. What made Yamamoto's dissent so striking and so uncomfortable for the institutions around him was that it came not from a pacifist or a liberal, but from one of the most technically accomplished and personally formidable officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was not soft. He was not cautious by temperament. He was, by any measure his peers applied, brilliant. A mathematician's mind behind a warrior's bearing. A man who had lost 2 fingers at Tsushima and who had spent 30 years studying the craft of naval warfare with something close to devotion. His opposition to the coming conflict was not rooted in squeamishness about violence or war itself. It was rooted in arithmetic. He had done the calculation, and the calculation returned the same answer every time. Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. Not in the long run, not given the disparity in industrial output, in raw material reserves, in population, in the simple, grinding capacity to produce ships and aircraft and trained men faster than they could be destroyed. This was not defeatism. This was mathematics. He said so to the men who held power. In conversations with prime ministers and cabinet members, he laid out his reasoning with the patience of a professor who has been asked the same question too many times and continues to answer it anyway, because the question keeps mattering. He reportedly warned one senior official that if war came, he could promise to run wild across the Pacific for perhaps a year and a half, but that after that, he could promise nothing, because there would be nothing left to promise with. The remark was not a boast. It was a warning, dressed as a military assessment, and the men who received it found ways, over time, not to hear it. It did not fit the story they were telling themselves and the nation. It did not fit the momentum that had been building since Manchuria, since Shanghai, since a decade of military adventurism that had generated its own internal logic and its own constituencies of the committed and the reckless. The ultra-nationalist movements that thrived in this environment were not subtle about their feelings toward officers who obstructed the national destiny as they conceived it. These were groups who had already demonstrated a willingness to murder. Senior politicians had been shot in their offices. A former prime minister had been assassinated on the street. Military officers considered insufficiently zealous had been killed in their homes. The threat was not rhetorical. When Yamamoto's opposition to the German alliance became known in the right circles, and in Tokyo in the late 1930s, such things became known quickly. The threats began arriving. Some came as letters. Some were delivered through intermediaries. Some were simply understood from the atmosphere, the way a man can feel when he has become a target in an environment where targets are sometimes acted upon. Yamamoto received these signals with a composure that those around him found either admirable or disturbing, depending on their own constitution. The Navy Ministry was placed in a position of considerable delicacy. Yamamoto was not someone who could simply be disciplined into silence. His record was too distinguished, his reputation too established, his standing among the officer corps too real. And yet his outspokenness was generating the kind of attention that made powerful and violent men restless. The ministry weighed its options with the care of an institution, trying to protect both a man and its own institutional equanimity. The solution it arrived at was, on the surface, a promotion. In the summer of 1939, Yamamoto was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Japan's supreme naval command, the pinnacle of operational authority over the most powerful naval force in Japanese history. It was, by any visible measure, an honor of the highest order. It was also, by any candid measure, a removal. The sea is vast and quiet. It is difficult to assassinate a man who is aboard a flagship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The appointment removed him from the drawing rooms and ministry corridors of Tokyo, where his opinions could be heard and his presence could be targeted. Aboard his flagship, surrounded by water and by the institutional protocols of naval command, He was beyond the reach of the men with grievances and pistols. His superiors could present the posting as the natural culmination of a brilliant career, which it also genuinely was, while solving their more immediate problem of keeping him alive long enough to be useful. Whether Yamamoto fully understood the dual nature of his appointment is a question the historical record leaves open. He was not a naive man. It seems unlikely that a mind as precise and unsentimental as his would have missed what was being managed. But if he understood, he accepted it without protest, because accepting it was consistent with the discipline of a naval officer, and because the alternative, remaining in Tokyo to be killed by a nationalist with a grudge, served no one, least of all Japan. What the appointment did not change was his opinion of the war that was coming. He had been moved to a position where that opinion was less publicly audible, but he had not abandoned it. In his correspondence from this period, letters to friends and former colleagues, written with the candor of a man who knew his time for open argument had passed, the same conviction runs through every line. He was not reconciled to the war. He was not persuaded by the arguments he had failed to counter with his own. He simply understood that he had lost the debate, that the institutional momentum carrying Japan toward conflict had become too powerful for any individual to redirect, and that his role now was not to continue arguing, but to serve. To serve the Navy, to serve Japan, to fight a war he believed could not be won in the terms that actually mattered. There is a particular kind of isolation that belongs to a person who sees the shape of a disaster before it arrives and is powerless to prevent it. It is not the isolation of ignorance, which can at least be remedied by information, nor the isolation of cowardice, which can at least be resolved by a choice. It is the isolation of clarity, of seeing what is coming, with a precision that your position does not grant you the authority to act upon. Yamamoto carried this weight aboard his flagship through the final months of peace, as the diplomatic cables between Tokyo and Washington grew shorter and colder, and the margins for maneuver narrowed toward nothing. He was surrounded by officers, by the machinery of the fleet, by the rituals of naval command, and yet, the essential problem he was living with was one he shared with almost no one, because almost no one around him was willing to acknowledge that the problem was real. The irony of his situation was not lost on those who watched it closely, and it was not lost on him. The Imperial Japanese Navy's most outspoken opponent of the war against the United States had been placed in command of the fleet that would fight it. The man who had spent years warning that the arithmetic of industrial power made a Japanese victory impossible was now responsible for the strategic planning that would open the conflict. He had argued, clearly and repeatedly, that the war should not begin. He was now the instrument by which it would. This was not a contradiction he had chosen. It was a contradiction that had been constructed around him by forces too large and too committed to be turned aside by one admiral's calculations, however correct those calculations ultimately proved to be. As 1939 gave way to 1940, and 1940 gave way to the final, narrowing months of 1941, Yamamoto's mind turned, as minds do when argument is exhausted, to the problem in front of him. If war was coming regardless of his wishes, then the only question remaining was how to fight it in a way that gave Japan any chance at all. His answer to that question would be daring, audacious, and ultimately insufficient. But it would begin, as all things in his life began, with an honest assessment of the odds, and a willingness to act on what that assessment revealed, even when what it revealed was very nearly hopeless. By 1940, the world had already shown Yamamoto something that most of his fellow officers refused to see. In the Mediterranean, the British had done the impossible. On the night of the 11th of November, 1940, aircraft from the British carrier Illustrious had flown through darkness toward the Italian fleet, sheltering in the harbor of Taranto, using slow, cumbersome torpedo bombers, ungainly machines that looked as though they should never have left the ground. The British had struck with devastating precision. 3 Italian battleships were hit, 2 of them sunk or crippled in the span of minutes. The entire strategic balance of the Mediterranean had shifted, not through the clash of battleships exchanging salvos across the horizon, as centuries of naval tradition demanded, but through the silent approach of aircraft in the night. Yamamoto had studied the Taranto operation with the intensity of a man watching history remake itself before his eyes. This was not theory, this was proof. The problem was that almost no one in Tokyo wanted to hear it. The Naval General Staff, the conservative admirals who controlled strategy and appointments, still worshipped at the altar of the battleship. In their minds, the true test of naval power came when great battleships, bristling with massive guns, engaged one another in daylight battles, where men could see their enemy, and death came in explosions of fire and steel. This was how Nelson had fought. This was how Togo had won at Tsushima, the sacred victory that defined Japanese naval glory. The idea that a handful of aircraft flown by men who were not even visible to the enemy could determine the outcome of a naval war struck many of these senior officers as not merely unproven, but almost obscene. They dismissed Taranto as a lucky blow against an unprepared fleet. They clung to battleships the way a drowning man clings to a log, even as the tide was already pulling him under. But Yamamoto had never been a man confined by the orthodoxies of his own service. He had spent years in America, walking through the vast automobile factories of Detroit, understanding viscerally that industrial capacity was not abstract theory, but the engine of modern war. He had sat in classrooms at Harvard and absorbed not just English language, but English thinking, pragmatic, mathematical, willing to discard old certainties when new evidence demanded it. When he studied naval aviation, he did not study it as a supplement to battleships. He studied it as a replacement. And by 1940 and into 1941, as Japan's military leadership pushed relentlessly toward war with America, Yamamoto had arrived at a conclusion that was almost too terrible to articulate. If Japan must fight the United States, Japan could only win by striking first, striking hard, and striking in a way that paralyzed American military power before it could respond. The logic was brutal and, to Yamamoto, inescapable. Japan could not win a long war against America. The disparity in industrial output, in raw material reserves, in population and manufacturing capacity was simply too vast. American factories would eventually produce more ships, more aircraft, more everything than Japan could ever destroy. But Japan's navy, in 1941, was still arguably superior in quality to the American fleet. The pilots were better trained, the carriers were first-rate, the aircraft were competitive. This window of advantage would not remain open forever. Every month that passed, American industrial might drew closer to dominance. The moment was narrowing. If there was to be a moment at all, it had to be now, and it had to be devastating. Yamamoto began to ask himself a question that his superiors were not yet ready to confront. Where was the one place where America kept the greatest concentration of its naval power? Where was the fleet anchored, vulnerable, and unprepared for the kind of blow that history had shown was now possible? The answer was obvious: Pearl Harbor. The concept that formed in Yamamoto's mind was operationally staggering in its ambition. A task force would sortie from Japan in complete secrecy, crossing the vast northern Pacific to approach the Hawaiian Islands from an unexpected direction. At dawn, Japanese carrier aircraft would strike the American fleet at anchor, destroying battleships and damaging supporting vessels before the Americans could even mount an effective defense. The strike would continue through a second wave, pounding the airfields, the repair facilities, the fuel depots, anything that would take time to rebuild. For 6 months, perhaps longer, the American Navy would be crippled. Japan would have that window of time to consolidate its position across the entire Pacific and Southeast Asia, seizing the resources and territory its military believed it needed. Perhaps, in that 6 months, the Americans would negotiate. Perhaps they would decide that the cost of retaking the Pacific was too high. The war might not end, but Japan might achieve something close enough to victory for the purposes of national survival. What Yamamoto did not say, because he could not say it without ending his career and possibly his life, was that he believed this would not work. He did not believe the Americans would negotiate. He did not believe 6 months of advantage could be converted into genuine victory against an industrial machine as vast as America's. But he believed it was the only option that even approached possibility. Any other strategy, a gradual expansion, a negotiated settlement without first striking, a defensive posture waiting for American reaction, was simply capitulation. At least this way, Japan would fight for something. At least this way, there was a chance, however remote, and if the path forward was only death anyway, it might as well be death with purpose. But explaining this to the Naval General Staff was another matter entirely. Yamamoto began to articulate the concept in the autumn of 1940, and the reaction from the service's institutional centers of power was something between skepticism and outright hostility. The plan was reckless. It required Japan to sortie its irreplaceable carriers across vast distances, through waters where American submarines lurked. The logistics were almost incomprehensibly complex, maintaining a task force at sea for weeks, refueling and reprovisioning without being detected. And the entire operation rested on a foundation of assumptions that traditionalist officers simply could not accept. Why send the valuable carriers on such a desperate venture when they should be supporting a surface fleet action where the real power of the Japanese Navy could be displayed? Why would striking an American fleet at anchor accomplish anything permanent? The Americans would rebuild. They always did. The fundamental strategic problem would remain unchanged. Yamamoto needed allies within the naval hierarchy, and he found them, most crucially, in Commander Minoru Genda and Captain Kameto Kuroshima. Genda was a brilliant carrier pilot and tactician who had already begun thinking along similar lines. Kuroshima was an imaginative planner with the kind of flexibility of mind that did not come naturally to the general staff. Together, these men began to develop the operational details of what would eventually be called Operation Z. They conducted war games, running the attack again and again through different scenarios, adjusting tactics and force composition with each iteration. They calculated fuel consumption, flight times, expected losses. They studied the geography of the Hawaiian Islands and the likely patterns of American naval operations. Through the winter and spring of 1941, as the Japanese military leadership inched closer to committing to war, Yamamoto's planning team worked in parallel, preparing for the war that might come by designing its opening battle. But even as the planning advanced, even as the operational details became more refined and realistic, the Naval General Staff remained unconvinced. There were meetings where Yamamoto presented his case, and there were objections, bureaucratic resistance, and the weight of institutional inertia. What finally shifted the balance was not brilliant argument, but rather Yamamoto's willingness to stake everything on his conviction. He indicated to his superiors that if the plan was rejected, he would resign as Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet. This was no theatrical gesture. Yamamoto meant it. In the Japanese military structure, the resignation of a commander of his rank and stature over a matter of strategic principle would have been a seismic event, broadcasting internally and internationally that there was a fundamental disagreement at the highest levels about how to conduct the war. The military leadership, already fragile in its consensus, could not afford such a rupture. Yamamoto had essentially told them, "You can have this plan, or you can have someone else in command of the fleet, not both." The choice, in the end, was not difficult. By the spring of 1941, the outline of Operation Z was approved. The Kido Butai, the strike force that would carry out the attack, would consist of 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku. These were the best carriers in the Japanese Navy, representing its true strength and its greatest vulnerability, because if they were lost, they would be almost impossible to replace. Alongside the carriers would come cruisers, destroyers, battleships, and supply ships, a force of extraordinary complexity that would need to operate thousands of kilometers from home, maintain strict secrecy, and execute a precision strike against one of the most heavily defended naval bases in the world. The planning grew more detailed with every passing week. Pilots trained in attack formations at specially constructed practice areas. New types of aerial torpedoes were designed specifically to work in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Maps were studied until they were memorized. Every officer and enlisted man involved understood that they were preparing for an operation that was either brilliant strategy or suicidal madness, and many of them were not entirely certain which. What made Yamamoto's insistence on 6 carriers significant was that it was not the minimum necessary to accomplish the operation. It was the amount necessary to accomplish it with a reasonable probability of success. Anything less, and he refused to approve the plan. This was not megalomania. This was the calculation of a man who understood that Japan was committing itself to a strategic gamble of almost infinite proportions, and that if the operation was going to be executed at all, it had to be executed properly. Half measures would squander the fleet and accomplish nothing. Better to do it right, with overwhelming force, or not to do it at all. The weight of that decision, the insistence on 6 carriers, would echo through every moment of the operation's execution, and far into the war that followed. By the summer of 1941, the operational plan was locked in. The date had not been chosen, but the season had been selected. In November or December, when American attention was focused on the Atlantic and on the presumed threat from the west, when the weather in the North Pacific would be at its harshest and least likely to attract observation, the Kido Butai would sail. It would cross thousands of kilometers of open ocean in strict radio silence. It would approach the Hawaiian Islands from the north, from a direction where American patrols had grown lazy in their predictability. And at dawn, on a day that had not yet been decided, Japanese aircraft would rise from the decks of those 6 carriers and fly toward Pearl Harbor. What happened next would depend entirely on whether the operation had been planned correctly, whether the enemy had failed to anticipate it, and whether the men who carried out the attack possessed the skill and courage that Yamamoto believed they possessed. The unthinkable had been conceived. Now it remained only to execute it. The Pacific Ocean in November stretches before imagination as something half alive, a vastness that swallows fleets whole and erases traces of human passage. Japan's naval strategists understood this. They understood that the ocean could conceal what the eye and the radio operator must never discover. In the waters north of Japan, where winter storms churn the surface and cold descends like a physical presence, a force unlike any assembled before in the history of naval warfare, gathered in absolute silence. This was the Kido Butai, the Mobile Strike Force, and for the first time in months of meticulous planning, it was no longer a collection of operational concepts sketched on staff paper. It was real. It was moving. It was pointing toward the other side of the world with an audacity that bordered on the incomprehensible. The assembly point was Hitokapu Bay, cradled in the volcanic Kuril Islands, where Japan's territory began to fray into empty ocean. The location had been chosen with obsessive care by the operations planners. It lay remote enough to hide the gathering storm. It lay far enough north that departure into the Pacific could follow a northerly route, a path of winter desolation, where no neutral merchant ships ran, where no American scout planes routinely patrolled. The bay itself, surrounded by dark rock and stunted vegetation, seemed almost designed for secrecy. Ships could anchor there and disappear from the world. For 6 days, from late November through the first week of December, that is precisely what happened. The force that assembled was staggering in its concentration of power. 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku, represented the cream of Japan's naval aviation. Each carried between 60 and 70 aircraft. Alongside them came 2 fast battleships, Kongo and Kirishima, whose armor and firepower could obliterate any surface opposition that might somehow materialize. Cruisers and destroyers screened the force. Tankers followed behind to ensure that so vast a fleet could sustain itself across the open Pacific. In total, more than 30 warships gathered in that cold grey bay, carrying roughly 400 aircraft. The precision of that number was not accidental. Every calculation, every ratio, every estimate of what would be required had been distilled into those specific vessels and that specific quantity of flying machines. The crews that boarded these ships came from the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were not conscripts or green replacements. The pilot roster carried names of men who had flown against the Chinese, who had logged hundreds of hours in combat conditions over Manchuria and the China coast, who had trained with an intensity that bordered on the spiritual. They knew the Zeros they would fly with an intimacy that approached partnership. They understood their aircraft not as machines, but as extensions of discipline and will. The ordnance crews, the mechanics, the signalmen, the communications specialists, all represented the accumulated expertise of a service that had been preparing for this moment for years, without quite admitting it to itself. They were embarking on the most distant naval operation ever undertaken by Japan, into waters where no Japanese warship had ventured in force, to attack an enemy that had committed no act of war against them. Yet when the order to board came, they moved with the compliance of men who had surrendered the question of why to the certitude of command. Secrecy demanded discipline, of an almost brutal kind. Radio operators understood that a single uncoded transmission, a single deviation from protocol, could alert the Americans to what was coming. The fleet maintained absolute radio silence. Officers moved among the ships, delivering orders by courier boat or signal light alone. The crews were told they were conducting an exercise. Some believed this. Others, watching the massive provisioning of ammunition, the loading of bombs and torpedoes, designed specifically for slow-moving battleships, understood with sickening clarity what was about to happen. The officers who knew the truth, who held copies of Operation Z in their safes, who had attended the final briefing where Yamamoto himself had outlined the stakes, carried the weight of that knowledge in isolation. They could not share it. They could not explain. They could only watch men clean their weapons and prepare their aircraft in the twilight of ignorance. This was the strategic requirement, that those who were about to carry out one of history's boldest military operations should not know what they were doing until it was already underway. On November 26, 1941, the Kido Butai weighed anchor. The date marked no significance outside the narrow circle of the Japanese Naval High Command and the cryptographers in the American Naval Intelligence Station at Pearl Harbor, who were already reading enough of Japan's strategic communications to sense that something vast was in motion. For the men aboard the Japanese warships, it marked the point of no return. The fleet moved northward first, deliberately choosing the most circuitous route across the northern Pacific. This was not inefficiency, but strategy. The winter shipping lanes, the routes used by merchant vessels and known to American observers, ran southward. By heading north, the Kido Butai would cross the Pacific, invisible to routine observation, hidden by geography and seasonal weather patterns. The northern route was brutally difficult. Winter storms in the North Pacific generated seas that towered over even the largest warships, swells that made maintaining formation an exercise in constant coordination. Destroyers, smaller and more vulnerable than the capital ships, pitched and rolled with alarming violence. The crews began the voyage seasick and exhausted, but they also began it unobserved. This was the calculation that Yamamoto and his planners had made. The suffering of the voyage purchased the invisibility, without which the entire operation was impossible. The command structure itself reflected the compartmentalized nature of operational security. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the senior commander of the Mobile Strike Force, sailed with the fleet aboard the flagship Akagi, coordinating the movement of the vast collection of warships and aircraft through detailed orders issued through established naval chains of command. But the conceptual author of the operation remained thousands of kilometers behind, in Japan, aboard his own flagship, the Yamato. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto maintained direct command over the combined fleet, but the actual execution of Operation Z fell to Nagumo and his immediate staff. This division of responsibility reflected both the practical necessity of command at a distance and a deeper reality. Yamamoto, having designed this operation through months of argument and insistence, having threatened resignation to force it upon a skeptical naval general staff, had surrendered its execution to another man's hands. He received reports. He could send orders. But as the Kido Butai crossed the northern Pacific in winter darkness, the critical decisions, moment by moment, hour by hour, belonged to Nagumo. Yamamoto could only wait and trust that the plan he had conceived with such meticulous care would survive contact with the chaos of actual warfare. The voyage itself stretched across more than a week of cold, rolling ocean. No American reconnaissance spotted the fleet. No merchant vessel radioed an alert that would later be compiled into intelligence reports at Pearl Harbor. The northern route, so bitterly uncomfortable for the men crowded below decks, so challenging for the maintenance crews, trying to keep aircraft in readiness, despite the violent motion of the carriers, achieved precisely what Yamamoto had calculated: invisibility. The fleet's course would keep it out of the areas where American patrol planes conducted their routine reconnaissance. The size of the force, more than 30 warships carrying thousands of men, somehow passed through the vastness of the Pacific without detection. This silence was not luck, though luck contributed. It was the result of operational planning that understood how to move massive forces through spaces that only appeared empty. The ocean, if you understood its geometry and its patterns, could hide almost anything. Deep in his headquarters in Japan, Yamamoto received regular reports on the progress of the Kido Butai. He knew the fleet was moving as planned. He knew that the northern route was holding. He knew that radio silence was being maintained with the discipline he had demanded. But he also understood something that few others fully grasped. The entire operation balanced on a single, precarious assumption. The American fleet had to be in harbor. The battleships that Japan sought to destroy had to be sitting peacefully at their moorings, unaware, unable to maneuver, vulnerable to the precise type of attack that the Japanese carriers were being dispatched to deliver. If the American fleet had sortied, if the battleships were at sea, if the American commanders had somehow understood what was coming and moved their forces to safety, then the Kido Butai would be hunting through empty waters. The operation would have failed before the first bomb fell. The strategic logic that had driven months of planning, the risk calculation that had convinced Yamamoto that a sudden paralyzing blow offered Japan its only chance, would collapse into irrelevance. This knowledge gnawed at him as the fleet moved across the Pacific. He had done everything possible to ensure success. He had designed the operation. He had demanded the resources. He had overridden objections and forced acceptance of a plan that many senior officers believed was reckless. And now, separated by 5,000 kilometers of ocean from the force he had created, he could do nothing but wait for intelligence reports that might tell him whether his assumption would hold, or whether Japan was about to commit the greatest naval force it could assemble to an operation whose very foundation was already crumbling into doubt. The fleet that sailed from Hitokapu Bay carried not only 400 aircraft and the most powerful collection of warships Japan had ever concentrated in a single force. It carried the weight of decades of strategic thinking, the crystallization of years of argument about naval doctrine, the embodiment of Yamamoto's conviction that carrier aviation had replaced battleship-centered strategy as the foundation of naval power. If this operation succeeded, it would validate everything Yamamoto had advocated for since the early 1920s. It would prove that the aircraft carrier, not the battleship, was the instrument that would determine naval warfare. It would demonstrate that surprise and air power could compensate for an enemy's industrial advantage and the possibility of a long attrition struggle. The crews who scrubbed the decks, who checked the aircraft, who maintained the systems that kept the fleet functional, understood little of this. They knew they were sailing towards something. They knew from the loading of ordnance and the scale of provisioning that it was something vast. But the full weight of what they carried remained hidden from them, locked away in sealed orders and operational briefs that would not be opened until they were already committed, already steaming toward their target, already beyond the point of return. As the Kido Butai pushed across the winter Pacific, the final pieces of the operation locked into place behind it in Japan. Yamamoto received confirmation that diplomatic negotiations with the United States were moving into their final, futile phase. The negotiations had always been something of a facade, a diplomatic courtesy extended to a process that everyone in the Japanese military leadership understood was already sealed. War was coming. Everyone knew this, except, apparently, the American officials who still conducted negotiations in Washington as if some peaceful resolution remained possible. The American ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph Grew, had warned his superiors that Japan was preparing something catastrophic. The warnings had been noted, filed, and largely disregarded, partly because intelligence reports offered no concrete evidence of the scale of what was coming. The American military intelligence apparatus was good, but it was not good enough to penetrate the security surrounding Operation Z. The Japanese military had learned lessons from previous operations. Secrecy this time was not assumed. It was enforced, demanded, and verified through constant checking and rechecking of who knew what and whether any breach had occurred. Yamamoto understood the geometry of the coming hours with a clarity that was almost painful. If he was right about the Americans' location and readiness, if the intelligence about the battleships remaining at anchor held true, if the fleet managed to reach its launch point undetected, If the pilots executed their training with the precision he had demanded, if the two waves of aircraft struck with the coordination that months of planning had anticipated, if all of these conditions held, then Japan would strike a blow that would echo across the Pacific for years. The American Navy would be damaged, perhaps crippled. The industrial heartland of the United States would be shocked and demoralized. Japan would have time, precious time, to consolidate its conquests across Southeast Asia, and perhaps to negotiate from a position of strength. But Yamamoto also understood what happened if even one of these conditions failed. If the American carriers were at sea, if the damage to the battleships proved less comprehensive than hoped, if the shock did not translate into strategic paralysis, then Japan would have started a war with the one power it could not defeat, in a war of attrition. The operation would have been successful tactically and catastrophic strategically. This knowledge, this understanding of the operation's narrow window of possibility, was something Yamamoto carried in silence as the Kido Butai cut across dark waters toward the decisive moment that would define the Pacific War and his own legacy. The fleet moved without communication to the outside world, without announcement, without any acknowledgement that something unprecedented was taking shape in the vastness of the northern Pacific. Ships maintained position through visual signals and careful maneuvering. Aircraft sat ready on the flight decks, covered by canvas, their engines cold, their weapons loaded, their pilots below, in ready rooms, reviewing flight paths and attack vectors they had memorized through months of training over Japanese waters. The crews existed in a state of strange suspension, preparing for something, waiting for something, knowing that the moment of revelation was approaching, but not yet here. They were caught between the ordinary routines of naval life and the extraordinary burden of what they carried. They cleaned their stations and checked their equipment, and maintained the discipline that held such a vast and complex force together across empty ocean. They did not know they were sailing toward a moment that would change the history of the Pacific, that would bring the United States fully into the Second World War, that would transform an operation conceived in Japan into an event that would echo across 70 years and beyond. They only knew that they were at sea, that their destination remained sealed in orders not yet opened, and that somewhere ahead, through the winter darkness of the North Pacific, lay whatever had brought them to this moment of suspended anticipation and gathering fatigue. The morning comes quietly at first. Across the island of Oahu, the 7th of December, 1941, arrives the way Sundays tend to, slowly, without urgency, wrapped in the particular stillness of a harbor at rest. Sailors sleep in their bunks aboard the great grey ships, moored in rows, along Battleship Row. Officers eat breakfast in their wardrooms. A few men stand early watch on deck, scanning water that catches the first light of a rising sun and throws it back in broken pieces across the harbor. Nothing announces what is coming. The sky above the Waianae Mountains is clean and broad, and entirely indifferent to what is about to happen beneath it. Far to the north, the first wave of aircraft, nearly 200 of them, is already descending. They come in low, organized into strike groups that have been rehearsed and re-rehearsed across months of preparation. Torpedo bombers follow the contours of the island, hugging the terrain as they swing toward the harbor entrance. Dive bombers climb to altitude, peeling off into their runs with the precision of men who know exactly what they are looking for and exactly where to find it. The first explosions arrive before the general alarm can reach every corner of the fleet. Within minutes, the quiet harbor becomes something entirely different, a place of fire and noise and churning water, of men running and ships listing, and the sky turned into a crowded, violent, terrifying thing. The attack unfolds in two waves, separated by roughly an hour, and in its combined effect, It is devastating beyond almost any rational prior expectation. 8 American battleships are sunk or damaged. Cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels across the anchorage take hits from bombs and torpedoes. Aircraft on the ground at nearby airfields are caught in neat rows and destroyed in large numbers before most of them can be made ready to fly. The attack kills more than 2,400 American servicemen, wounds nearly twice that number again, and in the space of a single morning reduces the backbone of the United States Pacific Battle Fleet to a broken, smoking row of steel on the shallow floor of Pearl Harbor. Back in Tokyo, in naval headquarters and government ministries, the reports arrive in sequence, and the rooms fill with something close to euphoria. Japan has struck the decisive blow. The Americans are crippled. The southern resource zone, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the strategically vital chain of islands stretching across the Pacific, is now, in theory, within reach and within grasp. The gamble, they believe, has paid off completely. Isoroku Yamamoto receives the reports aboard his flagship, anchored in the inland sea. He has been waiting through the night, absorbing the updates as they come in, measuring each figure against the plan he has carried in his mind for more than a year. The men around him expect him to share in the relief, perhaps even in the celebration that is spreading through the fleet and through the capital. What they observe instead is a man who listens carefully, says relatively little, and whose expression carries something that does not quite resemble triumph. He has been doing the arithmetic that the celebrations are designed not to do, and the arithmetic is telling him something the communiques are not. The American aircraft carriers are not in Pearl Harbor. They were not there when the strike went in. They are somewhere on the Pacific, intact, armed, and crewed by men who will now understand, with complete and terrible clarity, what this morning means. This is the wound beneath the wound. Yamamoto had built his strategic logic around the destruction of American naval power, not merely American battleships, but the carrier forces that he, more than almost any admiral alive, understood to be the decisive instruments of modern naval war. He had spent 2 decades arguing, against considerable institutional resistance, that the aircraft carrier had made the battleship obsolete as the queen of the fleet. He had staked his career on that conviction, had reorganized and retrained Japan's naval air arm around it, had designed the Pearl Harbor operation precisely to deliver a blow that carrier-based aircraft would deliver against carrier-based power. And now, on the morning of his greatest tactical success, the carriers are gone, not destroyed, but absent. The blow has landed on exactly the wrong ships. The remark attributed to him in the hours after the attack has passed into history with the weight of a verdict. That he feared he had wakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve, or some version of that thought, is a phrase so aligned with what the events subsequently proved that many have questioned whether it was ever truly spoken, or whether it accumulated its authority in retrospect, carried forward by the logic of what came after. But the sentiment, whether or not those were precisely his words, reflects something that was genuinely, verifiably his. A dread he had carried long before the first aircraft lifted from the Kido Butai's flight decks. A dread born from 2 years at Harvard, from the oil fields of Texas and the automobile plants of Detroit, from a decade of reading American industrial production figures and understanding what they meant for any prolonged Pacific war. He had seen the country, he knew what it could do, and he knew that the men who would read the morning papers in Washington and New York and Los Angeles had not been crippled by this morning. They had been ignited by it. Japan celebrates. The news reaches the public in carefully managed bulletins, framed as proof of Japanese naval supremacy and the correctness of the nation's strategic course. The attack on Pearl Harbor becomes the opening chapter of what Japan's military establishment presents as an inevitable and righteous assertion of power across the Pacific. In the days immediately following, as Japanese forces simultaneously strike the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and Wake Island, each success reinforces the narrative of an unstoppable momentum. The people are told that Japan has struck first, struck hard, and struck decisively, and the material facts of the 7th of December, taken in isolation, appear to support every word of that telling. More than 300 aircraft have participated across both waves. The harbor has been left burning. The American battle line has been broken in a single morning. By any tactical measure available in the immediate hours after the attack, the operation must be called a success. But Yamamoto sits with the fuller picture, and the fuller picture contains absences that a victory communique cannot paper over. The carriers, the fuel depot at Pearl Harbor, largely untouched, the submarine base, still operational. The repair infrastructure that will, in the months ahead, return several of those damaged battleships to service, something that would have been impossible had they been sunk in deep water rather than in a shallow harbor chosen by Yamamoto himself for exactly the reason that shallow water would allow his torpedo bombers to run their weapons without losing them in the depths. He had thought of nearly everything. He had been unable to think of a way to change where the carriers happened to be on a particular Sunday morning. And that gap between preparation and outcome, that single uncontrollable variable, now sits at the center of everything that will follow. There is a particular quality to the kind of dread that is correct and privately held while those around you celebrate. Yamamoto had spent years warning the people with actual authority over Japan's fate that a war with the United States could not be won in the long term, had said it to cabinet ministers, had said it in private correspondence, had said it plainly enough that ultra-nationalist factions had marked him for assassination, and the Navy Ministry had shipped him out to sea to keep him alive. He had been overruled, bypassed, and eventually handed the task of designing the very operation he had most feared would set the war in motion. And now the operation had been carried out, to enormous tactical effect, and Japan was at war with the most industrially productive nation on Earth, and the carriers were somewhere in the Pacific, and Yamamoto knew, in the way a man knows a thing that he cannot unknow, that the morning of December the 7th, 1941, had not ended the threat to Japan. It had defined it. The men who flew the mission do not yet know this. The pilots who return to the carriers are proud, exhausted, exhilarated. The officers who planned the third wave, later cancelled, argue for pressing the attack on the harbor's fuel and maintenance facilities. Yamamoto, working through his staff, does not order that third wave. Whether this represents a missed opportunity or a rational constraint under the circumstances remains a question that military historians have debated for more than 80 years without reaching a settled answer. What is clear is that the decision is made in the awareness that the carriers have not been found, and that extending the attack without knowing where they are introduces a vulnerability the entire operation cannot afford. The Kido Butai withdraws. The ocean closes behind it. The harbor keeps burning. What Yamamoto understands, as he reviews the final reports, is that Japan has won a battle and chosen a war simultaneously, and that the second choice is larger and more consequential than the first. The tactical success at Pearl Harbor will reverberate through history as one of the most audacious single military operations ever executed. But tactical success and strategic wisdom are not the same thing, and a man of Yamamoto's intelligence is not permitted the luxury of confusing them. He has bought Japan a window of time, 6 months, perhaps a year, perhaps a little more. in which the Imperial Navy can operate freely across the Pacific, while American naval power reconstitutes itself. What happens in that window will determine whether the gamble had any logic at all. He intends to use the time to force a second, more decisive engagement, one that will find and destroy the American carriers and settle, once and for all, what the 7th of December only started. In a harbor still smelling of fuel oil and smoke, the wreckage settles slowly into the mud. The water around Battleship Row carries an oily sheen that catches the afternoon light and throws it back in colors that do not belong to the Pacific. Across the island, men are already beginning the work of accounting for the dead, for the damage, for what comes next. In Japan, the celebrations have not yet quietened, and on his flagship in the inland sea, Yamamoto reads his dispatches, thinks his private thoughts, and understands, with the precision that has always distinguished him, that the war he feared has arrived exactly as he feared it would, not as the short, decisive conflict the Naval General Staff has promised the Emperor, but as something vast and patient and not yet fully awake. The shock of Pearl Harbor reverberated across the Pacific like the shockwave from a detonation. American installations across the ocean braced for follow-up attacks. In Washington, Congress convened in emergency session. President Roosevelt addressed a nation suddenly stripped of its illusion of safety, and in Japan, a tide of confidence swept through the military command structure, a conviction, felt almost as a physical sensation, that the moment of empire had finally arrived. Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato, received the reports of the Pearl Harbor strike with characteristic restraint. The battle was tactically flawless. The damage to American naval power was staggering. Yet he knew, with a clarity that eluded his jubilant colleagues, that the Americans would rebuild, retool, and return. The question was not whether Japan could win a single engagement. It was whether the nation could sustain victory long enough to impose terms before American industrial might became an unstoppable force. But in the weeks following that December morning, the speed of Japanese conquest seemed almost to vindicate the most optimistic planners. Admiral Yamamoto did not conduct the early campaigns himself. His role was strategic coordination and fleet positioning, yet every major operation unfolded within the larger architecture he had helped design. Malaya fell in just 7 weeks. The fortress of Singapore, considered impregnable by the British, who had garrisoned it for decades, surrendered on the 15th of February, 1942, after a siege that lasted barely a week. The Philippines, defended by American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur, became an American tragedy. Bataan collapsed in April. Corregidor fell the following month. MacArthur himself escaped to Australia, leaving behind thousands of troops who would endure the brutality of Japanese captivity. The Dutch East Indies, those vast archipelagos rich with oil, rubber, tin, and other strategic materials, fell in rapid succession. The invasion of Java was completed by early March. By summer, Japan had conquered more territory in a few months than most imperial powers had seized in decades. The speed was almost hallucinogenic. Japanese commanders found themselves fighting through jungles they had studied only on maps. Supply lines stretched across thousands of kilometers of ocean, yet somehow the momentum held. Burma fell. Rangoon was taken, cutting off the supply route to China and opening a path toward India. Thailand had been quickly brought into the Japanese sphere of influence. Hong Kong, seized in December, became a Japanese garrison. Wake Island, Guam, the Gilbert Islands. One by one, the strategic outposts across the Pacific flipped from American or British control to Japanese occupation. The maps in Japanese war rooms filled with red lines marking the expanding perimeter of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Officers spoke of the invincibility of the Japanese soldier. Naval aviators, intoxicated by their success at Pearl Harbor and in countless other engagements, began to believe in their own myth of supremacy. Yamamoto, however, was not intoxicated. His role during this period was to ensure that Japan's naval forces remained capable of supporting the expanding perimeter and, more importantly, to create conditions for a final, crushing engagement that would end the Pacific War before it truly began. The problem, which he understood with merciless clarity, was that the American industrial machine had barely been scratched. Pearl Harbor had been catastrophic for the United States Navy, yet American shipyards were already laying down new hulls. American aviation factories were retooling for mass production. The wound was terrible, but it was not fatal, not unless Japan could exploit the breathing space to impose a negotiated peace. Every day that passed meant American aircraft carriers, under construction, moved closer to completion. Every day brought more American sailors trained at accelerated schedules. Every day saw American industry converting from civilian production to an all-consuming military effort. Yamamoto pressed his superiors with almost desperate intensity. There must be another engagement, a decisive confrontation that would destroy what remained of American naval power and force the United States to accept terms. To that end, he coordinated the first major offensive operations following the initial conquests. In February and March of 1942, Japanese carrier task forces operated in the Indian Ocean, striking Ceylon and conducting raids on shipping lanes as far west as the coast of East Africa. These operations achieved their tactical objectives: ships sunk, installations damaged, but they also demonstrated a troubling vulnerability. Japanese carriers, however skilled their pilots and however formidable their aircraft, were not omniscient. They could not be everywhere. The Indian Ocean operations, while striking, did not fundamentally shift the war's trajectory. They were episodes in a larger narrative that Yamamoto was trying to write, a narrative in which Japan seized the initiative and never released it. The devastating raid on Darwin in February 1942 showed both the power of Japanese naval aviation and the limits of what that power could accomplish. Darwin, the northernmost significant port in Australia, was struck by Japanese carrier aircraft launched from a fleet operating in the Timor Sea. The attack killed hundreds of people and destroyed military facilities. It sent a message to Australia that the war was coming south with terrible speed, yet it did not destroy Australia's capacity to continue fighting or to serve as a base for American operations. The raid was terrifying in its immediacy and its violence, but it was not strategic. Yamamoto grasped this distinction, even as Japanese commanders elsewhere were celebrating each tactical success as though it were a strategic triumph. A ship sunk was good, supplies destroyed were good, but destruction without purpose, without moving Japan closer to a negotiated end to the war, was merely delay, dressed in the language of victory. By mid-1942, Yamamoto had orchestrated the design of what he believed would be the decisive operation, the assault on Midway Atoll. The logic, as he conceived it, was elegant and predatory. Midway, a small atoll nearly halfway across the Pacific, held an American airfield and American naval facilities. If Yamamoto could lure the American carrier fleet into a decisive engagement while conducting the Midway operation, he could destroy the remaining American carriers in a single, overwhelming blow. With the carrier threat eliminated, Japan would possess undisputed control of the Pacific. American attempts to relieve besieged positions would fail. Japan could consolidate its conquests and impose a peace settlement. The strategy was not irrational. It was, in fact, the logical endpoint of the thinking that had produced Pearl Harbor. Strike suddenly. Strike with overwhelming force. Destroy the enemy's capacity to resist. Dictate terms. But the very success of the early conquests created a strategic problem that Yamamoto could not articulate clearly to his superiors without sounding defeatist. Each new conquest pushed Japan's perimeter outward, requiring more ships, more aircraft, and more men to defend. The supply lines became longer and more vulnerable. The distances that had to be covered in any future engagement grew. Japan was not building new capital ships at anything approaching the rate America would soon achieve. Japan was not training new pilots at American production rates. Japan was losing pilots regularly, and in the Japanese naval system, experienced pilots were removed from combat only rarely, so every loss was permanent. Yamamoto could see the mathematics of the problem, even if he could not persuade others to see it clearly. Japan had won a magnificent victory at Pearl Harbor. The subsequent conquests had been stunning, but they were the last victories of a nation that could not afford to win any more, because each victory brought the day closer when American production would arrive in overwhelming quantity. He understood something that most Japanese commanders could not yet bring themselves to understand. Japan was fighting time. It was fighting American factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles. It was fighting shipyards that could lay down a new carrier in months, whereas Japan's shipyards required years. It was fighting a nation of 130 million people with resources and industrial capacity that dwarfed Japan's own. The solution, in Yamamoto's mind, was not to prolong the war, not to consolidate the conquests, not to build defensive lines and wait for the Americans to dash themselves against them. The solution was to force a decision. There had to be a crushing naval engagement that would break American will to continue the war in the Pacific. There had to be a moment in which the Americans would recognize that they could not win and would agree to negotiate. This conviction, that time was working against Japan, that only a decisive offensive could prevent eventual catastrophe, drove Yamamoto through the spring of 1942 as he prepared the Midway operation. He moved through the vast apparatus of the combined fleet like a man possessed by a terrible certainty. His subordinates saw only the methodical admiral. They did not fully comprehend the urgency beneath the surface, the desperate intelligence that told him the window of opportunity was closing with each passing week. He coordinated with the army. He ensured that the Navy's resources were allocated to this operation. He refined the plans through war games and simulations. He demanded that his officers understand the complexity of the operation and the precision required to execute it. And all the while, the tide of Japanese conquest continued to roll across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the surface appearance of overwhelming success masking the deeper truth that Yamamoto could see with perfect clarity. Japan was not winning the war. It was losing it more slowly than it would have without the early victories, but it was losing nonetheless. The reports on American industrial output that crossed his desk painted a picture of catastrophe in slow motion. New shipyards coming online, new aircraft designs entering production, new pilots graduating from training programs that American efficiency was making larger and better every month. Yamamoto spent hours studying these reports, the way a man studying a fatal diagnosis studies the medical notes of his own death. He knew what others would not yet admit, that the 6-month offensive operations in the Pacific, glorious as they appeared, were consuming resources that Japan could not replace. Every ship sunk in combat was a loss that American shipyards would compensate for within weeks. Every aircraft shot down meant an American factory would build its replacement, often in a variant that incorporated lessons from the engagement. Every pilot killed was a loss Japan could not sustain. because Japan did not have a pilot training system capable of replacing trained combat aviators at industrial scale. America did. This was the reality beneath the celebration. This was what drove Yamamoto to press for Midway. This was the mathematics of desperation, disguised as strategic brilliance. He had opposed the war because he understood the answer to the most fundamental question: could Japan win? And the answer had always been no. But since war had come despite his opposition, the only remaining question became, how long could the war be compressed before American production made it absolutely unwinnable? The answer, he believed, was months, perhaps a year at most. And in that window, there had to be one devastating blow, one crushing engagement that would shatter American confidence and force negotiations. Without that blow, Japan would be fighting an uphill battle that could only get steeper with time. The conquered territories would have to be defended against increasingly powerful American counterattacks. The combined fleet would be whittled down by attrition. The flow of replacements would slow, and then, inevitably, would come the day when American naval power exceeded Japanese naval power so completely that the war would become merely a matter of time and mathematics, the slow, grinding conquest of Japanese-held territory until Japan itself was threatened. By late spring of 1942, as the Kido Butai prepared for the Midway operation, Yamamoto was the only man in the Japanese high command who fully grasped the terrible arithmetic of the war he had tried to prevent. He had helped design the opening attack because he was the only commander skilled enough to do it. He had orchestrated the follow-up conquests because that was his duty. He had coordinated the raids into the Indian Ocean because they served the larger strategy. And now he was preparing for Midway because it represented the last realistic opportunity to force the outcome he desired: an American capitulation or acceptance of negotiated terms before American industrial capacity became completely overwhelming. He did not speak of these thoughts. He did not burden his subordinates with the weight of his understanding. He was an admiral, and admirals commanded fleets in pursuit of victory. The private knowledge that the war was already lost the moment Pearl Harbor failed to destroy the American aircraft carriers, was something he carried alone. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Isoroku Yamamoto stood at a crossroads that would define not just his career, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The initial shock of Japan's stunning victories had faded into something more troubling: the realization that the American fleet was still intact, still fighting, and already beginning to rebuild. Yamamoto understood with crystalline clarity what most Japanese admirals refused to acknowledge: that Japan had won a tactical triumph, but squandered the strategic moment. The American aircraft carriers that should have been destroyed at Pearl Harbor had been at sea that December morning, preserved by accident or fortune to become the instruments of Japan's eventual undoing. To Yamamoto, the mathematics of the situation were unforgiving. Japan had no way to match American industrial capacity. No assembly line in Nagoya or Kure could produce warships and aircraft fast enough to replace losses at the rate the Americans could. If the war became a grinding contest of attrition, Japan was already losing. There was, in his mind, only one path forward: force a decisive naval battle before the American war machine reached full capacity, annihilate the enemy's remaining carriers in a single catastrophic engagement, and negotiate peace from a position of naval superiority that the Americans would have to respect. It was a gamble built on hope and mathematics, and Yamamoto committed himself to it entirely. By early 1942, as Japanese forces continued their sweeping conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Yamamoto began sketching the operation that would become his masterwork and his undoing. The target was Midway Atoll, a small American base lying roughly 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii, sitting astride the lines of communication that bound Pearl Harbor to the American Pacific Fleet. Midway was nearly indefensible, a speck of coral with a handful of buildings and an airfield, garrisoned by a modest force of American servicemen who watched the horizon and reported weather. But Yamamoto did not want Midway for itself. He wanted it as bait. The logic was elegant and deadly. If Japan threatened Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the American Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, would have no choice but to send his remaining carriers to defend it. Yamamoto would be waiting with a vastly superior force, a fleet of such overwhelming strength that the American carriers would be crushed in detail, sunk before they could inflict significant damage. With American carrier power eliminated, the Pacific would belong to Japan. Hawaii could be invaded, the war could be won. It was the strategy of a man running out of time. The operation that Yamamoto designed in the spring of 1942 was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its complexity. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would form the strike force, supported by 2 light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, spread across multiple task forces, separated by hundreds of miles. A diversionary fleet would attack the Aleutian Islands in the far north, drawing American attention away from the main blow. Advanced submarines would be positioned to report the American fleet's movements and, ideally, damage it before the carriers even came into range. The plan required perfect coordination across vast distances, flawless execution under pressure, and one critical assumption: that the Americans would respond exactly as Yamamoto predicted. The Japanese Navy's command structure approved the plan, though not without internal argument. More conservative admirals worried that the operation stretched supply lines too far, that the dispersed Japanese forces could be defeated in detail if something went wrong, that the whole affair smelled of desperation dressed up as boldness. But Yamamoto's prestige was immense, and his insistence on the operation's necessity overrode the doubts. When he threatened to resign if the plan was rejected, the opposition crumbled. Operation MI, as it was designated, was set in motion. What Yamamoto did not know, what neither the Japanese Navy nor the Japanese government understood, was that the Americans had been reading Japanese radio traffic with increasing confidence and accuracy. Deep in a basement in Hawaii, in a small unit called Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, American codebreakers and linguists had been working to break and exploit Japan's main naval cipher, known to the Allies as JN-25. The work was grinding, imperfect, and often incomplete. But by May of 1942, the codebreakers had extracted enough of the Japanese message traffic to understand the broad outlines of what was coming. They knew that something major was being planned. They knew that Midway was the target. They could not read every message with perfect clarity, but they read enough. The intelligence reached Admiral Nimitz, and Nimitz, a man of measured temperament and sharp judgment, made a decision that few commanders would have had the courage to make. He would position his carriers not in the expected location, but in an ambush position northeast of Midway, out of sight, waiting. If the Japanese came as predicted, they would sail directly into a trap, set not by luck, but by knowledge. The American fleet would be vastly outnumbered. Fewer carriers, fewer battleships, fewer of almost everything. But it would have the one advantage that mattered. It would be expecting the Japanese arrival and prepared to strike first. On the 4th of June 1942, Japanese scout aircraft began reporting sightings of the American fleet. The Americans were there, scattered across the ocean in the exact positions Yamamoto had predicted they would be. But the Americans were also waiting. Japanese aircraft took off from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in waves, striking at the American ships. But the American carriers were equally ready. American dive bombers reached their targets with devastating timing and accuracy. The Battle of Midway, when it came, did not unfold as Yamamoto had planned. Instead of a methodical annihilation of American forces, it became a catastrophe that unfolded in minutes. Within hours, within a single morning, 4 of Japan's finest carriers, the nucleus of the combined fleet's striking power, were on fire and sinking. Akagi, still glorious and smoking, went under first. Then Kaga, then Soryu, then Hiryu, the last to fall, burning so intensely that her crew had to abandon ship hours before she finally sank beneath the waves. Hundreds of experienced pilots and naval aviators, men who had trained for years and fought at Pearl Harbor and across Southeast Asia, were trapped on those ships as they sank, or were killed in the water by sharks and exhaustion, or watched helplessly from lifeboats as their nation's dreams sank with their ships. The American forces lost an aircraft carrier as well, the Yorktown, but it was a trade the Americans could afford and the Japanese could not. When the reports reached Yamamoto aboard his flagship, the battleship Yamato, the magnitude of the catastrophe was not immediately apparent. Japanese radio operators were reporting sightings and skirmishes, but the full scope of the losses was concealed by the fog of battle and by the reluctance of junior officers to deliver bad news to their commander. Yamamoto, standing on the bridge of the Yamato, absorbed the fragmentary reports with a silence that gradually transformed into something like stone. He had gamed this battle 100 times, war-gamed it, studied it, refined it. He had believed that the complexity of his plan, the vastness of the forces at his disposal, the professional superiority of Japan's naval aviators would guarantee success. He had believed, or had allowed himself to believe, that his will alone could bend events to his design. But events had refused to cooperate. The Americans had not acted according to script. The Americans had known. Somehow, impossibly, the Americans had known, and they had set a trap so perfect that Yamamoto's own plan had walked directly into it. A man who had staked everything on one roll of the dice had lost that roll. The question now was whether Japan could survive the consequences. The Japanese military establishment moved swiftly to contain the damage. The damage to the strategic situation was irreversible, but the damage to morale and to public confidence in the Navy could be managed through silence and careful propaganda. The losses were concealed from the Japanese public, which was allowed to believe that the battle around Midway had been a success, or at worst, a minor setback. The newspapers printed triumphant accounts of naval victories. American ships were claimed sunk that had not been sunk. American aircraft were claimed shot down in numbers that were wildly inflated. The truth, that Japan had lost the 4 fleet carriers that formed the core of its naval offensive power, that hundreds of irreplaceable pilots had been killed, that the strategic balance of the Pacific had shifted in a single day, was kept from the civilian population, and even from large portions of the military itself. Some officers learned the truth through rumor and whisper. Some understood it in the days that followed, by reading between the lines of official reports. But the truth did not become public knowledge in Japan until after the war had ended. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, which Pearl Harbor had seemed to confirm, died in the waters northwest of Midway on the 4th of June, 1942. That this death was kept secret only meant that Japan would continue fighting after its fundamental hope was already dead. Yamamoto bore the weight of this in solitude. He did not make excuses. He did not blame his subordinates. He did not, as far as the historical record shows, engage in the bitter recriminations that might have been justified. Instead, he accepted responsibility, quietly and completely, and he moved forward into the new reality that Midway had created. The Japanese Navy still had ships, still had aircraft, still had men and courage and the capacity to fight, but it no longer had the overwhelming carrier strength that might have allowed it to dictate terms in the Pacific. Every carrier Japan lost would be replaced slowly and inadequately. Every pilot killed would be replaced by someone with less training. Every ship sunk would drain resources from factories that were already struggling to keep pace with demand. The mathematics had shifted decisively in the Americans' favor. Yamamoto had made his gamble to reverse that mathematics, and he had failed. The catastrophe was not complete. Japan would continue to fight ferociously across the Pacific for nearly another 3 years, but the path to victory had closed on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942. Yamamoto understood this immediately. The question that would consume him for the remaining year of his life was whether the Japanese government would ever understand it, and whether, even if it did, there was anything left to do except fight on toward an outcome everyone should now be able to see. In the weeks following Midway, Yamamoto worked to reorganize the shattered combined fleet, moving quickly to salvage what remained, to repair what could be repaired, to retrain pilots and reassign personnel, to maintain some semblance of operational capability. But there was a weariness in these efforts that had not been present before. A man who had designed a perfect plan and seen it fail in hours cannot help but question the entire framework of assumptions that led him to believe in that plan in the first place. Yamamoto did not question openly. His duty would not permit that. But the private cost of Midway was evident to those close to him. His staff officers noted a change in his temperament, a quietness that bordered on melancholy. He had entered the war opposed to it, convinced that Japan could not win against American industrial power, but he had nevertheless committed himself to the one strategy that might have changed the equation. That strategy had failed, and now there was nothing to do except command the fleet in a war that was already lost, fighting battles that would delay but not prevent the inevitable outcome. The weight of that contradiction between duty and wisdom, between loyalty to the service and honesty about its prospects, would only grow heavier in the months and years that followed. The immediate operational consequence of Midway was that Japan's initiative in the Pacific passed irrevocably to the Americans. Yamamoto had designed Operation MI to seize control of the strategic situation and hold it through overwhelming force. Instead, the operation's failure transferred control to an American command structure that would now decide when and where to attack, and Japan would be forced to respond. The first American response came just 2 months later, in August of 1942, when American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Yamamoto committed the combined fleet to this campaign in an attempt to retake the island and preserve Japanese territorial gains. But Guadalcanal would become a 6-month grinding campaign of naval battles, air battles, and surface engagements that would bleed the combined fleet white, not in a single catastrophic day like Midway, but in 1,000 small attritions that accumulated into disaster. Every surface action that Japan won at night was a tactical victory purchased at a strategic cost it could not afford. Every American aircraft that was shot down was quickly replaced. Every Japanese aircraft lost was one less that would ever fly again. The island would ultimately be abandoned by Japan, but not before the combined fleet had expended resources that it never regained and lost pilots whose experience could never be replaced. Yamamoto's private correspondence and the recollections of his staff in the months after Midway paint a portrait of a man who understood with painful clarity what had happened and what it meant for Japan's future. He had one of the finest strategic minds of the war, and he could read mathematics. He had read, during his years at Harvard, accounts of American industrial capacity, American resources, American population. He had understood from the beginning that a long war with America could not be won. But he had also understood, or thought he understood, that a single, perfectly executed blow might change the equation. Yamamoto had staked everything on that belief, and Midway had proven it to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The tragedy of Yamamoto, and perhaps the tragedy of Japan itself in this war, was that his failure did not end the war. It only ensured that the war would continue on terms that were utterly unfavorable to Japan, through channels that Yamamoto could no longer control. He would fight on because that was his duty, but the man who had once believed that brilliant strategy might snatch victory from the jaws of American superiority now knew better. That knowledge would drive the remaining chapters of his life toward their inevitable conclusion. The ships came home in silence, not the silence of a fleet at rest, but the silence of men who had witnessed something they were not permitted to describe, who had watched fire consume the vessels they served, who had pulled survivors from water that smelled of aviation fuel and burning wood, and who had been ordered, before the coast of Japan came into view, to say nothing. The Kido Butai, or what remained of it, returned to Hashirajima anchorage under cover of darkness, carefully separated from the main fleet anchorage, isolated from the ordinary traffic of a navy still conducting its business as though the world had not shifted beneath it. The wounded were moved ashore through channels deliberately obscured from public view. The dead remained uncounted in official records. Japan had not lost a battle. Japan had not lost 4 carriers. These things had simply not occurred. Isoroku Yamamoto received the final casualty figures in the days following his fleet's withdrawal, and the numbers settled over him like weight. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone, taking with them not merely steel and fuel and aircraft, but something far harder to replace: the accumulated skill of hundreds of trained aviators, men whose expertise had been built across years of rigorous preparation and combat experience, men who existed nowhere else in the Japanese order of battle and could not simply be manufactured alongside the aircraft that would be denied them anyway. Yamamoto had entered the Midway operation, commanding the most powerful carrier strike force on Earth. He emerged from it, commanding a fleet that had lost its cutting edge in a single catastrophic morning, stripped of the air groups that had made every victory of the preceding 6 months possible. He was still commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. The fleet, however, was no longer what it had been. He bore it alone, in the way that men of certain temperaments bear the things they cannot speak aloud. His flagship was the Yamato, a vessel of extraordinary size and power, arguably the most formidable battleship afloat, a ship so massive and so carefully guarded that it had never fired its main guns in anger. Yamamoto had little faith in battleships, had spent much of his career arguing against their primacy, and there was something almost grimly appropriate about the fact that he spent the worst days of his professional life aboard the greatest of them, unable to act, unable to speak, able only to sit with what he had done and what it had cost. Those who served close to him in those weeks described a man who remained outwardly composed, courteous, methodical, attentive to routine, but whose composure had taken on a different quality, the quality of a surface held very deliberately still above something turbulent beneath. He wrote letters during this period, to friends, to the families of officers who had been lost, And in those letters, careful as they were, there are traces of a man attempting to locate himself in relation to an outcome he had not adequately prepared for. The war games conducted before the Midway operation had in fact surfaced scenarios not unlike what had occurred. A discovery of the fleet by American reconnaissance, a strike under unfavorable conditions, catastrophic carrier loss, and those scenarios had been, in the language of planning, adjusted, walked back, corrected in favor of more optimistic projections. Yamamoto had approved the operation, knowing its vulnerabilities. He had trusted in speed, in surprise, in the professionalism of his aviators. He had trusted, perhaps, in the mythology of Japanese naval superiority that Tsushima had planted in his generation, and that a string of stunning victories had seemed to confirm. That trust had been returned to him in ruins, off the northwest coast of a coral atoll that most of Japan had never heard of. The Naval General Staff processed the disaster with an institutional reflex that prioritized secrecy above all else. The surviving crews were quarantined from the general naval population, transferred to remote postings, discouraged from corresponding freely. Officers who might talk were reassigned. Medical records for the wounded were filed under classifications that obscured their origin. The logic, if it could be called that, was straightforward. A public that believed Japan was winning would continue to support the war, and a navy that appeared unbeaten could still negotiate from strength. The reality that the strategic balance of the Pacific had shifted, that the period of Japanese initiative was ending, that the attrition war Yamamoto had always dreaded was now effectively underway, was a reality that the Naval General Staff was not prepared to communicate to anyone, including the government ministers, whose strategic planning depended on accurate information. There is a particular cruelty in this silence, and Yamamoto existed at its center. He had opposed the war. He had warned against it, with unusual directness for a man of his rank and culture. He had been placed in command of the fleet that started it, precisely because his superiors wished to contain his dissent, and, by making him responsible, bind him to the outcome. And now, having designed the strike on Pearl Harbor, having led the fleet through 6 months of extraordinary conquest, having conceived and executed the Midway operation, with all its fatal flaws, he was required to carry the weight of a disaster he could not publicly acknowledge, answering to a staff that had applauded his victories and would not share his defeats. The Naval General Staff was equally responsible for Midway, for the overconfidence, the strategic overreach, the dispersal of forces, the failure to correct the planning process when war games revealed its weaknesses. But responsibility, in the culture of Imperial Japan's military establishment, did not diffuse. It concentrated in the man who commanded. What Midway destroyed, beyond the carriers and their air groups, was a certain kind of time. Japan had understood, at some level of strategic clarity, that it possessed a window, a period during which American industrial capacity had not yet converted itself into combat power, during which the Pacific Fleet was rebuilding, during which Japan could press its advantages and perhaps force a negotiated peace before the weight of American production became irreversible. Yamamoto had understood this more clearly than almost anyone, had pushed for the Midway operation specifically because he believed a decisive engagement could close that window from the American side before it had fully opened from Japan's. Instead, the engagement had closed it from Japan's. The carriers were gone. The trained aviators were gone. The window had not been shut. It had simply been handed to the other side. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility had its roots in Tsushima, that extraordinary engagement of 1905, in which the Imperial Japanese Navy had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Strait. Yamamoto himself had lost 2 fingers at Tsushima, had watched the Russian fleet destroyed around him, had absorbed the lesson, shared by his entire generation, that Japanese naval skill and determination could overcome material disadvantage. The victories of the first 6 months of the Pacific War had seemed to extend that myth into a new era, to confirm that what had been true in 1905 remained true in the age of the carrier and the aircraft. Midway killed that myth, quietly, in waters that saw no public acknowledgement. It did not kill it in the newspapers, or the radio broadcasts, or the communiques that described the operation as a tactical withdrawal following the sinking of one American carrier. It killed it in the private understanding of the men who had been there, and in the knowledge that Yamamoto carried aboard the Yamato, and in the gap between what Japan's official narrative said and what the actual fleet was now capable of doing. He requested, in the weeks after Midway, that he be allowed to bear formal responsibility, to step down or accept public censure. The request was declined. The Naval General Staff needed him. There was no one else of his stature, his operational experience, his authority over the combined fleet's officer corps, who could hold the position together, and so he remained, and the silence remained with him, and the war continued on its trajectory. He turned his attention to the South Pacific, to the island chains, and the air attrition campaigns that would define the next phase of the fighting, approaching each operational problem with the same methodical professionalism that had always characterized his work. But something had changed in the architecture of his thinking. Before Midway, his plans had contained, even beneath their private pessimism, a residual faith that a decisive stroke could still alter the war's direction. After Midway, that faith was not entirely gone, but it had narrowed, become more conditional, more aware of the distance between what the plans required and what the fleet could actually deliver. There were quieter casualties of Midway that do not appear in the casualty reports. The generation of aviators lost over and around the atoll, not only in the carrier strikes, but in the land-based attacks and the desperate combat air patrols, represented a depth of training and experience that Japan's naval aviation school system could not replenish on any timeline the war would allow. A trained naval aviator requires years to develop fully, years of flight school, of carrier qualification, of combat experience, that only combat itself can provide. Japan had been producing exceptional aviators since the early 1930s, and those men had been the foundation of everything the Kido Butai had accomplished. Their replacements would be younger, less experienced, less prepared for the kind of sustained, high-intensity combat that the Pacific War was about to demand of them. Yamamoto understood this. The numbers that came across his desk in the weeks after Midway made it impossible not to understand. The waters northwest of Midway, where the Akagi and her sisters went under, did not mark the end of anything that was visible from Tokyo. Life in the capital continued. The newspapers continued. The radio programs continued. The official confidence of a nation at the height of its power continued, carefully maintained by men who knew that maintaining it was now the most important thing they could do. But beneath that surface, in the private understanding of the men responsible for the war's prosecution, something fundamental had ended. Not the fighting. The fighting would continue for 3 more years, at terrible cost to both sides. Not the commitment. Japan's military and political establishment would prosecute the war with ferocious intensity long after its outcome was, in retrospect, clear. What had ended was the possibility. The brief, extraordinary window during which Japan might have forced a conclusion on terms it could accept had closed in a single June morning. In the time it took for American dive bombers to push over from altitude and find the flight decks of 4 carriers with their aircraft spotted, fueled, and armed. Yamamoto had seen that window from the beginning. He had spent his professional life trying first to prevent the war from opening it, then to force its closure before the Americans could respond. He had failed in both directions. What remained was to lead a fleet he knew could not win the war it was being asked to fight, against an adversary he had understood since his years walking the wide avenues of an American country that was only now beginning to remember how angry it was. The news arrived like a cold front moving through the fleet. Somewhere in the southern Solomons, on an island most Japanese naval officers would have struggled to locate on a map just weeks before, American Marines had gone ashore. It was the 7th of August, 1942, barely 2 months after the catastrophe at Midway, and the landing on Guadalcanal was not a raid. It was an occupation. The Americans had seized a partially completed airstrip carved from the jungle by Japanese construction workers, and they intended to keep it. For Yamamoto, still carrying the private weight of 4 sunken carriers and the public silence that surrounded that loss, this was not simply a tactical problem to be managed. It was an existential challenge. Whoever held that airstrip, which the Americans quickly renamed Henderson Field, held the ability to project air power across the southern Solomon Islands and, eventually, much further. If Japan could not take it back, the entire strategic logic of the defensive perimeter his country had purchased so dearly now pointed in the wrong direction. He committed the combined fleet almost immediately. The decision was not made lightly, and it was not made with illusions. Yamamoto understood, perhaps better than any other senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, what sustained attrition against American production capacity would mean over months and years. But the alternative, conceding Henderson Field and the momentum it represented, was worse. The Navy Ministry and the Army pressed for a swift recapture, framing Guadalcanal as a temporary nuisance that would be resolved in weeks. Yamamoto's planners were less sanguine. The Americans had entrenched quickly, their Marines were well supplied by sea during the initial landings, and Henderson Field was already receiving aircraft. Taking it back would require naval superiority in the surrounding waters, which meant fighting for it. Night after night, convoy after convoy, engagement after engagement, in the narrow channels and open anchorages around the island that would eventually earn a name that told its own story: Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese Navy had genuine advantages in those early months. Night surface combat was one of them. Japanese sailors and officers had trained obsessively in low-light tactics, and their long-lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled, longer-ranged, and faster than anything the Americans carried, gave surface forces a lethal edge after dark. In the chaotic engagement off Savo Island in early August, a Japanese cruiser force descended on an Allied naval patrol in the small hours of the morning and administered one of the most one-sided defeats in American naval history, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in roughly half an hour. The Americans, still learning the rhythms of this campaign, had been caught disorganized and unprepared. It was a stunning tactical victory, and yet Henderson Field remained in American hands the following morning, resupplied and operational, its aircraft rising with the daylight to complicate every Japanese move that followed. This was the pattern that would repeat itself with agonizing consistency over the months ahead. Japanese tactical success in the dark, American strategic resilience in the light. The campaign settled into something neither side had fully planned for, a sustained, grinding struggle for control of the waters around a single island. Japan ran what became known as the Tokyo Express. High-speed destroyer runs down the slot, the channel between the islands of the Solomons chain, attempting to land troops and supplies on Guadalcanal under cover of darkness before American aircraft from Henderson Field could rise to intervene. The runs were often successful in transit, but frequently disastrous in delivery. Supplies dumped in drums and floated ashore. Troops landed exhausted and under-equipped. All of it conducted at speed under threat of air attack at first light. The Marines ashore, meanwhile, were fighting in jungle conditions of extraordinary brutality, not only against Japanese troops but against tropical disease, mud, and supply lines that stretched across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The island consumed men and materials from both sides, but it consumed them at different rates, and that difference was beginning to matter. Yamamoto pressed forward with naval gunfire missions intended to neutralize Henderson Field from the sea. On at least 2 occasions, battleships from the combined fleet moved into the waters north of Guadalcanal, in the darkness, to bombard the airstrip directly, and these missions caused real damage, cratering runways, destroying aircraft on the ground, disrupting American operations for hours at a time. But the field was never silenced for long. American engineers worked through the nights, and the aircraft returned with the mornings. Each mission required Yamamoto to commit irreplaceable capital ships to narrow waters within range of land-based air, accepting risks that would have been considered absurd in any strategic calculus before Guadalcanal. The island was warping the logic of the entire campaign, pulling resources toward it like a gravity well, demanding more than it ever gave back. The air battles above and around Guadalcanal were, in some ways, the most painful dimension of the attrition. Japan's naval aviators were, man for man, among the finest in the world, the product of a training program that had selected and shaped them over years of rigorous preparation. But that very selectivity meant they were finite. There were not thousands of replacements waiting in training establishments to take the place of a veteran Zero pilot lost in a dogfight over the Solomons. When an experienced American pilot went down, the vast machinery of United States training programs was already producing the next generation to take his place. When a Japanese pilot with 2 years of carrier experience and months of combat behind him failed to return from an escort mission over Guadalcanal, the gap he left was not so easily filled. Yamamoto had understood this arithmetic before the war began. He was living inside it now, watching the ledger close in one column and not the other. The naval battles multiplied through August, September, October, and November. Cape Esperance, the Santa Cruz Islands, the first and second naval battles of Guadalcanal, Tassafaronga. Each engagement had its own shape, its own terrible accounting. At Santa Cruz, Japanese aviators scored heavily against American carriers, leaving one sunk and another badly damaged. By any narrow measure of exchange, ships hit, aircraft downed, sorties flown, Japan could point to moments of tactical success, but the Americans who fought at Santa Cruz were the latest generation of a force that was already reconstituting itself, drawing on industrial output that the Japanese side could not match or even meaningfully threaten. Japan's carrier air groups, sent ashore to Guadalcanal to reinforce land-based operations, never fully recovered the losses they absorbed during these engagements. The experience and skill that had built them over years was being spent irreversibly on a campaign that could not be won by tactical victories alone. Yamamoto followed all of it from his flagship, the great battleship Yamato, anchored for much of this period at Truk in the Caroline Islands. He studied the operational reports with the same methodical attention he had always brought to his work, and those around him noted how rarely he expressed the kind of satisfaction that tactical results might have justified. He knew what the reports did not say. He knew what the numbers looked like when extended forward in time, when the rates of attrition were projected against known production figures on both sides. The officers around him saw a man who worked through each day with characteristic calm and personal discipline. His shogi games in the evenings, his letters composed with care, his manner unruffled in the presence of subordinates. But those closest to him understood that the calm was not the calm of confidence. It was something closer to the composure of a man who has accepted what is coming and chosen not to speak it aloud. Japan made one major effort to turn the land battle decisively in its favor during the October fighting, committing substantial army forces to a coordinated assault on Henderson Field from the jungle. The plan called for the army to capture the airstrip while the Navy suppressed it from offshore, and positioned a convoy to land reinforcements and supplies the moment the field changed hands. The operation required precise timing across multiple elements under jungle conditions that made precise timing nearly impossible. The assault failed. The Marines held the perimeter, Henderson Field remained operational, and the convoy, already approaching, had to turn back without landing its cargo. The Army's confident predictions of success had shaped the naval planning around the assault, and when the Army fell short, the naval commitments made in anticipation of victory became simply more loss, more expenditure, more irreplaceable tonnage sent to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. By November, the campaign was approaching its most desperate phase. Japan mounted a major effort to deliver heavy reinforcements to Guadalcanal by sea. A convoy of troop transports escorted by warships, running the gauntlet of Henderson Field's air power in daylight, accepting losses in exchange for the chance to land enough soldiers to change the equation on the ground. American naval forces, including 2 battleships rushed down from the north, met the Japanese escort force in a chaotic night action of extraordinary violence. The fighting was close, confused, and brutal. Ships firing at ranges where radar and searchlights replaced doctrine, where identification of friend and foe collapsed in the darkness. The Americans lost cruisers and destroyers. Japan lost battleships damaged and destroyers sunk. Most of the troop transports were destroyed before their soldiers could be brought ashore. The men who did reach Guadalcanal landed without their equipment, their food, or meaningful ammunition. They were not a reinforcement. They were survivors. Yamamoto absorbed the November battles and the convoy disaster with the same outward control that had become his way of carrying things he could not say. The combined fleet was not broken. It remained formidable, still capable of local victories, still possessed of skilled officers and capable ships. But it was different from what it had been in December of 1941, in April of 1942, even in the bright, terrible morning of the 7th of December, when the Kido Butai's aircraft had risen from 6 carriers, and everything had seemed possible. The pilots were different. The air groups were thinner. The margins that had made Japan's opening campaign so devastatingly swift were narrowing with each week the Guadalcanal campaign continued. In February of 1943, Japanese forces completed a skillful evacuation of the island's surviving defenders. A retreat, disguised as reinforcement, carried off in darkness with the kind of tactical precision the Navy still possessed. The island was gone. The airstrip that had started all of this, the strip of jungle-bordered coral that had pulled the combined fleet into 6 months of grinding loss, now belonged to the Americans permanently, and from it their aircraft would range further south and further west with each passing month. The evacuation was presented in official communiques with careful language, and the Japanese public heard of it in terms that did not suggest catastrophe. But Yamamoto understood the shape of what had happened here. He had fed the campaign resources he could not replace, knowing at some level, perhaps from the very beginning, that the island would not be recovered. He had done so because the institutional logic of the Navy, the demands of the Army, the requirements of national face, and the genuine uncertainty of every individual engagement had made each commitment seem locally defensible, even as the aggregate moved steadily in one direction. The men lost at Guadalcanal, the pilots above all, the hundreds of irreplaceable trained aviators whose names would not appear in public announcements, were gone in a way that no tactical success could undo. The waters around that island had taken them, and the waters kept what they took. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific War had entered a phase of brutal arithmetic. Japan still held vast territories, from the Philippines to the edges of Australia, yet the mathematics of attrition had begun their quiet work, eroding the fleet that had swept all before it merely 16 months earlier. Midway had been a catastrophe concealed in silence, but Yamamoto knew the true cost in a way that official reports could never capture. 4 fleet carriers transformed into wreckage, hundreds of skilled naval aviators gone into the sea, the myth of invincibility fractured beyond repair. Guadalcanal had become a grinding hell, where night after night Japanese destroyers raced down Iron Bottom Sound, only to limp home diminished, their hulls scarred by American shells, their crews gaunt with exhaustion. The Americans, by contrast, built new ships faster than Japan could sink them, and trained replacement pilots who, though less experienced than their predecessors, arrived in steadily increasing numbers. Yamamoto understood this imbalance with the clarity that came from his years in America, where he had walked through automobile factories and oil fields and grasped the true scale of American industrial capacity. Now that capacity was turning its full weight against him, and every month of delay made the mathematics more hopeless. Yet Yamamoto was not a man prone to surrender, and the thought of simply retreating and defending diminishing territory violated everything he believed about the aggressive prosecution of war. He carried instead a last conviction that one more major offensive, properly conceived and ruthlessly executed, might yet shift the psychological and material balance just enough to force a negotiated settlement before Japan's remaining resources drained away entirely. This conviction would yield Operation Igo. The campaign was devised in the closing weeks of March and launched in early April of 1943, with the explicit purpose of seizing the initiative in the South Pacific Theater and halting the American momentum before it became unstoppable. The target was the American air presence in the Solomon Islands and eastern New Guinea, where American squadrons had been steadily consolidating positions and beginning to project power farther northwestward. Yamamoto's plan was characteristically bold. He would concentrate not merely naval aviation, but also the strongest elements of Japan's land-based air forces in a coordinated, sustained assault lasting several weeks and aimed at destroying American aircraft and warships in sufficient quantity to damage American morale and force a reassessment of strategic objectives. The operation would unfold across vast distances, from bases in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, from forward airfields hastily prepared in jungle clearings, from the carriers of the combined fleet steaming into position in the waters north of the Solomons. Yamamoto himself would journey to forward bases to oversee the campaign, to coordinate operations across the dispersed command structure, and to demonstrate through his personal presence the importance he attached to what he clearly understood might be Japan's last chance to seize initiative before the Americans' material advantage became total. The campaign would deploy not only carrier-based air groups, scarce and precious resources after Midway, but also the best-trained land-based pilots Japan could assemble, drawn from home island training units and forward positions, concentrated in the belief that one overwhelming blow might accomplish what Japan could no longer achieve through sustained attrition. It was an operation that required Japan to spend resources Japan did not truly possess in pursuit of a victory that became less achievable with every passing week. The operation commenced in the first days of April, with reconnaissance flights confirming American positions and subsequent waves of Japanese aircraft striking at Guadalcanal and nearby positions with mounting intensity. Aircraft from the Zuiho, Zuikaku, and Shokaku, carriers that had survived Midway and been repaired and recommissioned, were committed to the campaign, their pilots drawn from the dwindling pool of experienced aviators still alive. These carrier pilots were invaluable, irreplaceable assets, yet Yamamoto committed them to extended operations far from the safety of their parent ships, operating from jungle airfields, where logistics were chaotic and losses could not be quickly replaced. The land-based bomber and fighter squadrons came from Rabaul and other northern bases, from airfields across New Guinea, from positions stretched across the vast geography of the southern reaches of Japan's empire. For several weeks, the tempo of operations was intense and unrelenting. Dawn patrols launching into humid tropical skies, strikes against American positions, interception battles when American fighters rose to meet the Japanese formations, the grim statistics of aircraft shot down, damaged beyond repair, or simply worn out by constant operations. The Japanese pilots who flew these missions were increasingly exhausted, many of them veterans of dozens of combat sorties over months of continuous warfare, their reflexes starting to slow, their concentration fragmenting under the accumulated weight of fear and fatigue, and the knowledge that they were flying against an enemy with seemingly infinite reserves of pilots and aircraft. Yamamoto received daily reports of successes: enemy aircraft destroyed, American warships damaged or sunk, enemy bases bombed and strafed. The numbers climbed steadily through April and into May, painting a picture of Japanese dominance and American decline that accorded with Yamamoto's hopes and satisfied the optimism of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. Yet the reality visible only to those actually in the combat theater was considerably grimmer. American pilots, trained to the best of American capability and blessed with superior aircraft design in several critical categories, proved formidable opponents despite their relative inexperience. The Vought Corsair fighter, which had only recently arrived in significant numbers in the South Pacific, could match or exceed the maneuverability of the best Japanese fighters and significantly outperform them in sustained climb and structural durability. American pilots also benefited from fighting in the vicinity of their own bases, meaning that pilots who were shot down could often be recovered if they ditched in the right location, whereas Japanese pilots lost over open water or behind American lines were gone permanently. The mathematics of air combat began to run against Japan even as the official reports celebrated Japanese victories. Experienced Japanese pilots were shot down and killed, and Japan had no advanced training pipeline to produce replacement pilots with anywhere near the experience of those being lost. American replacement pilots arrived by the hundreds, trained in formation flying and gunnery and tactics, entering combat as part of an ever-growing machine of American air power, rather than as isolated replacements desperately needed to fill gaps. The Americans, furthermore, were reading Japanese radio traffic well enough to anticipate where Japanese airstrikes would occur, allowing them to concentrate their fighters at threatened points and inflict concentrated damage on incoming Japanese formations. The cumulative effect was that Operation Igo, despite the Japanese numerical superiority at any given moment, and despite the tactical successes achieved in individual engagements, was actually draining Japan's air forces at a rate that was unsustainable. Yamamoto, from his position aboard the battleship Yamato, was receiving optimistic after-action reports that did not reflect this grinding reality. The officers and enlisted men who composed the operational command structure had every incentive to present successful campaigns in the most favorable light, and there was a gap between the actual number of enemy aircraft destroyed and the claims submitted in official reports. Japanese pilots, excited in combat and often unable to confirm the ultimate fate of damaged American aircraft, frequently reported enemy aircraft destroyed, when in fact, those aircraft managed to limp back to American bases for repair. The American industrial base could repair damaged aircraft on a scale that Japan simply could not match, meaning that the counting of damaged aircraft as equivalent to destroyed aircraft was a fundamental error in the strategic accounting. Furthermore, the actual losses of experienced Japanese pilots, the most irreplaceable assets in any air force, were not being communicated to Yamamoto with sufficient clarity or urgency. Reports filtered through the chain of command that emphasized successes, victories, and the mounting toll on American forces. But the parallel reporting of irreplaceable Japanese aircrew losses was muted, less visible, buried in dense statistics that did not convey the actual human and professional catastrophe occurring. Yamamoto received a picture of an operation that was succeeding, that was damaging American air power in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, that was providing the spark of offensive momentum Japan so desperately needed. The reality, which would only become clear in retrospect, was that Japan was trading experienced pilots and scarce aircraft for damaged American aircraft that were being repaired or replaced, while the Japanese pilots were simply gone. By late May of 1943, Operation Igo had expended itself. The initial intensity of operations could not be sustained, partly because the forward bases were exhausted logistically, partly because aircraft losses had mounted to the point where further sustained operations would render the air forces unable to defend Japanese territory itself, partly because American resistance had stiffened and American numerical superiority in the theater had only grown. Yamamoto made the decision to conclude the major offensive phase of the operation and withdraw the carrier air groups back to positions where they could be withdrawn from combat or reassigned to fleet operations. The official after-action reports were compiled and submitted, and they painted a portrait of success. Enemy aircraft destroyed in the hundreds, American ships damaged or sunk, American air power in the region severely degraded, Japanese supremacy asserted across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. These reports satisfied the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. They provided material for the controlled Japanese press to celebrate, and they appeared to validate Yamamoto's strategic vision for a bold offensive that would recover Japanese initiative. The optimism in these reports was genuine, in the sense that they reflected what the officers writing them believed to be true based on the information they possessed. But the optimism was also catastrophically misleading. What Yamamoto could not know, what no amount of available intelligence could have revealed to him, was that Operation Igo had consumed experienced pilot training stock that could never be replenished. The pilots who had died in Operation Igo in April and May of 1943 were disproportionately the men with 2, 3, or 4 years of combat experience, the core professional officers and enlisted flyers around whom the Japanese naval air arm had been built. They were replaced, eventually, by younger pilots with far fewer flight hours and minimal combat experience. Pilots who would be sent into future battles against an American Air Force that was growing stronger, more numerous, and increasingly proficient. The attrition of experienced personnel during Operation Igo represented a threshold that Japan could not recover from. Furthermore, the expenditure of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and logistical resources in support of the operation had been enormous, and those resources could not be easily replaced given the state of Japan's economy and the growing scale of American submarine operations against Japanese supply lines. In the months and years to come, the consequences of Operation Igo would become apparent to every Japanese commander. The air forces would be progressively weaker, the defensive operations would be increasingly desperate, and the margin of survival would contract toward zero. Yamamoto himself appeared to understand, at some intuitive level, that Operation Igo represented something more than merely one offensive among others. He had taken the unusual step of being present at forward positions to oversee the campaign personally, flying in and out of Rabaul and forward bases, meeting with commanders, observing operations. This presence was unusual for a fleet commander of his rank and responsibility, and it suggested that Yamamoto grasped the significance of the moment, even if the full strategic implications were not yet apparent. He was, in a sense, attending the funeral of the offensive capability of the Japanese Navy, even if he could not have articulated it in those terms at the time. The period immediately following Operation Igo saw Yamamoto increasingly concerned with defensive problems: how to hold the Solomon Islands, how to rebuild damaged ships, how to organize the remaining forces for fleet actions that might yet prove decisive. The confident, aggressive planning that had characterized his command in the months immediately following Pearl Harbor was shifting subtly toward a defensive posture, though one still animated by the hope that some combination of skill, surprise, and aggressive action might yet change the trajectory of the war. The campaign had cost Japan something that could never be replaced and could never be quantified in the official statistics submitted to Tokyo: the confidence of the naval aviation community that Japan could continue to fight the Americans on equal terms through superior skill and aggressive action. The pilots who survived Operation Igo, the commanders who had overseen it, the ground crews who had maintained the aircraft, all of them knew, at some level, that the operation had been expensive beyond official accounting. Word filtered through the officer corps of how many experienced pilots had been lost, of how the replacement pilots arriving from home island training units were barely qualified to fly their aircraft safely, of how American air power seemed not merely to match Japanese air power, but to exceed it in every measurable dimension. The mythology that Japan's trained pilots were superior to American pilots, that Japanese tactical skill and courage could overcome American numerical advantage, began to crack during Operation Igo and would splinter completely in the campaigns that followed. Yamamoto would not live to see the full consequences of this psychological and material transformation, but Operation Igo marked the point at which the outcome of the Pacific War had become, for those with the clarity to see it, effectively predetermined. By the spring of 1943, the American code-breaking operation against Japanese military communications had matured into something between art and science. In the basement of a building in Hawaii, teams of linguists, mathematicians, and signals officers worked around the clock to penetrate the layers of encryption that protected Japan's most sensitive naval traffic. They called their effort Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, or FRUPAC, and over months of patient work, they had reconstructed enough of the Japanese naval cipher, known by the Americans as JN-25, to read fragments and eventually whole passages of Japanese orders. The Americans did not read every message, and many transmissions remained dark, but they read enough. They read enough to know where ships were being sent, when supply convoys were departing, and increasingly, they read enough to anticipate Japanese strategy before it unfolded. In early April of 1943, the codebreakers intercepted a message that rose immediately above the routine traffic of daily operations. It contained a detailed itinerary, a timetable with specific dates and locations, for an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. The message specified that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself would be conducting the tour, traveling in a Betty bomber escort by a small flight of Zero fighters. The dates were precise: the 16th of April, the 17th of April, the 18th of April. Each location was named. Each arrival time was given. It was, for an American intelligence officer, the gift that might come only once in a war. The exact movements of an enemy commander, delivered by his own network, decrypted and legible. The message was stamped with the highest classification and forwarded immediately up the chain of command. When the decrypt reached Admiral Chester Nimitz at his headquarters in Hawaii, he understood immediately what was being offered. Yamamoto was traveling to Bougainville Island on the 18th of April. The itinerary suggested an arrival time of around 0930 hours local time. Nimitz could intercept him. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most celebrated naval commander of Japan, the man whose genius had shaped every major Japanese operation in the Pacific, could be killed. Nimitz had to make a decision that transcended military tactics and touched something deeper. The question of whether an individual life, however consequential, could be targeted with the full machinery of American military power. He did not make this decision alone. The decrypt was sent to Washington, to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the question was placed before President Franklin Roosevelt himself. The debate, where it happened, was brief. Roosevelt understood the strategic mathematics. Yamamoto was not merely an admiral, he was a symbol. Killing him would strike at Japanese morale, at a moment when the balance in the Pacific was beginning to shift. The American victories at the Coral Sea and Midway had checked the momentum of Japanese expansion, and now the Americans were beginning to move forward, taking small islands, establishing air bases, building the infrastructure of an island-hopping campaign that would take years but was now clearly inevitable. Yamamoto represented the last promise of Japanese dominance. Roosevelt authorized the interception. The order came down through Nimitz to the fighter squadrons in the Solomon Islands. An extraordinary mission was being planned, one that had perhaps never been attempted before. A long-range, low-altitude intercept over open ocean, timed to the minute, flown over enemy territory against a target that would be in the air for only a fraction of the expected window. The commander who received the order was a fighter pilot named Major John Mitchell, based at Kukum Field, near Henderson Field, on Guadalcanal. Mitchell was experienced, trained in long-range escort missions, and known for his ability to execute complex navigational problems under pressure. He selected 16 Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters, twin-engine, long-range fighters that were becoming the workhorses of American fighter operations in the Pacific, and assembled his pilots for a mission briefing that revealed the target with an almost dreamlike quality. They were going to intercept and destroy Admiral Yamamoto. The pilots understood they were not being asked to find and chase an uncertain target. They were being given an itinerary. They knew when to launch, what altitude to fly, what heading to maintain, and within a window of roughly 5 minutes, where Yamamoto's aircraft would be in the sky. The mechanics working on the 16 Lightnings understood the significance of what they were doing, though the pilots had been ordered to say nothing. The aircraft were prepared with extra fuel tanks to extend their already impressive range even further. Every detail was examined. The pilots studied maps of the route over open ocean north of Guadalcanal, then inland over jungle. The distance was roughly 435 miles each way. The fuel calculations were precise and punishing. There was virtually no margin for error, no room for detours or delays. If the intercept did not happen at the calculated time and place, the Lightnings might not have enough fuel to make it back to Guadalcanal. The pilots understood. They were being asked to fly to the edge of the possible, possibly beyond it. On the morning of the 18th of April, 1943, the 16 P-38 Lightnings began their takeoff run from Kukum Field. The sound of their engines filled the humid air of Guadalcanal, as they climbed and wheeled northward over open water, maintaining an extraordinarily low altitude, between 200 and 500 feet above the ocean, to avoid detection by Japanese radar and observers. Major Mitchell calculated everything: the wind, the drift, the fuel consumption, the speed. The pilots flying in formation behind him were young, many in their mid-20s, and they had been trained for this moment without knowing it. The flight north across open ocean took an hour. Below them was nothing but water and the occasional island, small specks in the vast blue. Ahead was jungle. Ahead was the appointment with history. Yamamoto and his small entourage had departed early that morning from Rabaul in a Betty bomber, a fast, twin-engine transport aircraft painted in standard green and grey. He was accompanied by a Zero fighter escort of 6 aircraft, the small detail he believed sufficient for a morning flight through friendly skies. Yamamoto was travelling light, without the armour plating or additional protection that might have suggested he understood he was anything but secure. He was the supreme commander, surrounded by Japanese air superiority, flying through Japanese-controlled airspace. The thought that Americans might be in the air, at his altitude, at precisely his time and location, would have seemed not merely unlikely, but impossible. The Betty droned over the jungle of Bougainville at around 6,000 feet. As Major Mitchell's 16 Lightnings approached the intercept point, a small rise in the terrain, the pilots saw them, 2 Betty bombers and their Zero escort, precisely where the intelligence had said they would be. The timing was so exact that it seemed to confirm something beyond mere coincidence. The Betty carrying Yamamoto was the slightly lower of the 2 transports. Mitchell made the identification and gestured his fighters into position. The Zeros saw them. What followed happened with the speed and violence of air combat compressed into seconds. The Zeros broke to engage the Lightnings, trying to protect the Bettys. The American fighters, faster in level flight and more maneuverable at the altitudes being fought at, overwhelmed the escort. Guns flashed. One of the Bettys, the one that did not carry Yamamoto, was hit immediately and began to smoke. The Betty, carrying Yamamoto, tried to climb and turn away, its pilot desperate to reach the cover of the jungle. The aircraft was fast for a transport, and it was already committed to an evasive maneuver. But the Lightnings were faster, and multiple pilots had him locked in their sights. Tracers cut through the morning air. The Betty's left engine was hit. Smoke began to pour from the damaged engine. The aircraft's speed dropped. It could not climb. The jungle, which might have offered concealment, was still several miles ahead. The Betty was doomed in that moment, and its pilot knew it. He tried to glide it toward the jungle, toward any place that might allow a crash landing with survivors, but the aircraft was losing power and altitude simultaneously. The other Betty had already been destroyed, falling in flames. The Zeros, overwhelmed and cut off from the bombers, began to break away. The Betty, carrying Yamamoto, crashed into the jungle of Bougainville Island in a clearing, the fuselage coming to rest among the trees with tremendous force. The impact was catastrophic. Japanese search parties that would reach the site within hours found the wreckage scattered across the clearing. Yamamoto was discovered in the cockpit, still strapped in his seat, motionless. His 2 fingers, lost so many years before at Tsushima, had been all that remained of his connection to that victory. Now he was gone entirely, killed not by the clash of fleets or the collision of tactics, but by an intercepted message, a calculation of speed and distance, and 16 American pilots flying toward the edge of their fuel reserves. He was 58 years old. He had given his entire life to the Navy. He had tried to prevent this war, had warned against it, and in the end had directed its opening action, and spent 3 years bearing the knowledge that nothing he had done could change its ending. The American pilots turned their lightnings south toward Guadalcanal, watching their fuel gauges as they flew. Some of them would make it back to the airfield with just moments of fuel remaining, engines dying as they rolled onto the runway. The mission had been a success by any measure of military calculation. They had killed the enemy commander. They had struck at the heart of Japanese morale. But success in war is never clean, never simple. The very fact that such an interception was possible, that an American intelligence officer could decrypt an enemy message, that an admiral could order an assassination, that a bomber carrying a nation's most decorated commander could be intercepted over its own airspace. These facts spoke to realities that were becoming increasingly clear as 1943 progressed. Japan had lost the technological initiative. America was reading its codes. America had pilots and aircraft and fuel to spare, enough to launch extravagant missions on the chance of eliminating a single commander. Yamamoto had feared this from the beginning. He had seen it coming across the Pacific from America's vast industrial capacity. On the 18th of April, 1943, the future that Yamamoto had always known was inevitable finally caught up with him over the jungle of Bougainville. The morning of the 18th of April was quiet over the Solomon Islands. A thin layer of cloud hung above the dense green of Bougainville's jungle canopy, and the ocean beyond was a study in greys and soft blues. Admiral Yamamoto's two transport aircraft, Betty bombers, their twin engines humming with the rhythm that had carried him across the Pacific for 4 years, were flying in formation at roughly 2,000 feet, following a coastline they had traveled many times before. The Admiral sat in the lead aircraft, composed as always, his uniform immaculate, despite the heat and humidity of forward air operations. Around him sat his staff officers and his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, along with various attendants and guards. This was meant to be a routine inspection, the kind of morale-building tour that senior commanders conducted to visit their distant units and acknowledge the sacrifice of their men. No one in those aircraft understood that the thin air around them had become a trap, or that the Americans had read their schedule with the precision of a surgeon reading an X-ray. The 16 Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters of the U.S. 13th Air Force had departed from their base in the early hours, and their pilots had flown for more than 4 hours in formation at wave-top height over open ocean. The route was calculated to the minute, the timing so precise that missing Yamamoto's aircraft by even a few seconds would mean losing him entirely in the vast expanse of sky and jungle. These were experienced pilots, men who had learned their trade over months of Pacific combat, and they flew with the kind of focus that comes only from knowing that success requires absolute perfection. Their leader, Major John Mitchell, kept the formation steady as they approached the northern coast of Bougainville. The Betty bombers would have to appear on schedule, flying from the staging field at Balalale Island toward the forward base at Kahili, exactly as their flight plan had indicated. The Americans knew the route. They knew the altitude, they knew the time. All they had to do was be there. At 0935 hours, the American pilots spotted the two transports and the Japanese escort fighters flying above them. The Betty bombers were slightly behind schedule, but only by minutes. The P-30s broke into their attack formation with the predatory grace of hunters who have finally spotted their prey after a long stalk. What followed was an explosion of violence compressed into seconds. The snap of high-caliber machine gun fire, the shriek of engines pushed beyond their limits, the spiral of an aircraft mortally wounded and falling toward the jungle below. The first Betty bomber, the one carrying Yamamoto, was struck repeatedly by the American guns. Its left engine burst into flames and separated from the wing. The aircraft pitched down in a dive that steepened with the force of dying momentum, its fuselage trailing smoke like a comet burning through the atmosphere. For a few terrible seconds, anyone who was still conscious aboard that aircraft would have felt gravity assert its dominance, pulling them downward toward the green wall of the jungle, rising to meet them with absolute finality. The Betty crashed into the dense forest, roughly 10 kilometers south of the town of Bowen. Its impact, so violent that the aircraft was nearly consumed by the jungle itself, broken into fragments, scattered across the forest floor, in a debris field that spoke of the immensity of forces involved in aviation at war. The second Betty, carrying Rear Admiral Ugaki, crashed into the sea offshore, and Ugaki somehow survived the impact and swam to shore, where he would eventually be rescued by a Japanese seaplane. But the first aircraft, the one that mattered to history, remained in the jungle, its wreckage cooling in the humid air, its occupants either dead upon impact or dying in the moments that followed. Japanese search parties were mobilized immediately, alerted by the loss of radio contact and the reports of aircraft going down in the vicinity. The jungle of Bougainville was thick and nearly impenetrable in places, a maze of green that could swallow men and machines with equal indifference. Searchers moved through the tangle of vegetation with desperation in their movements, pushing through vines and over fallen trees, knowing that they were looking for survivors and fearing they would find only the dead. What they found, as the afternoon light began to fade and the shadows of the jungle deepened, was the wreckage of the first Betty bomber. And in that wreckage, in the pilot's seat, was the body of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still strapped in by his harness, his uniform torn, but his face composed in a kind of serene mask. He was dead, killed either by the impact or in the moments immediately after, his body subjected to all the forces of a high-speed collision with the earth. The Japanese search party brought him from the aircraft with the care due to a man of his rank and stature, and his body was carried to a nearby village, where it was laid upon a table and examined. The cause of death was apparent, but what struck the officers who saw him was a kind of peace in his expression, no sign of the prolonged agony, no mark of final terror. He had been brought down while in motion, his attention forward, his command still in his hands. There was, in the eyes of those who found him, something almost fitting in that. Word came to Tokyo slowly, through channels that first confirmed the loss and then gradually revealed the identity of the dead. By the 19th of April, the High Command knew that Yamamoto was gone. The implications unfolded like a stone dropped into still water, concentric rings of shock spreading outward through the Navy Ministry, the Imperial General Staff, the government itself. A messenger was sent to inform the Emperor, and the Emperor's expression, recorded only in the accounts of those present, moved briefly through surprise and into something deeper and more difficult to name. Yamamoto had been one of the few naval figures with direct access to the throne, a man whose counsel had been sought and whose loyalty had never been questioned. Now he was gone, and the war would continue without him, bereft of his guidance and his increasingly urgent warnings about the mathematics of production and attrition. The military leadership faced an immediate practical problem that was also a profound question of national will. Yamamoto's death was a catastrophe that needed to be explained, and the explanation opened directly onto the question of whether Japan's strategy was succeeding or failing. If Yamamoto was dead because his aircraft had been shot down in what was supposed to be secure Japanese territory, what did that suggest about Japanese air superiority? If his whereabouts had been known precisely enough to plan an ambush, what did that suggest about the security of Japanese communications and the integrity of the codes that transmitted operational orders? These questions could not be answered directly, because answering them would require an admission that Japan was losing the war, an admission that the public had not yet been forced to entertain, and that the military establishment was deeply unwilling to make. For weeks, the military debated how to announce Yamamoto's death to the public, if at all. Some argued that concealing it entirely might preserve morale, that the death of the nation's greatest admiral could become a devastating blow to a public still largely sheltered from the true course of events. Others argued that Yamamoto's stature demanded a formal announcement, that concealing his death would be a kind of betrayal of the man and his service. The debate extended through the highest levels of government, with the Navy Ministry taking positions and the Imperial General Staff offering counter-arguments. All parties understood that the announcement, whenever it came, would carry within it a message about the state of the war and the prospects for Japan's future. In the end, the decision was made to announce his death in late May, nearly 6 weeks after the crash in the Bougainville jungle. The delay itself was a kind of testimony to the shock and the difficulty of the choice. His body, recovered from the jungle and brought by sea to a forward base, was not returned to Japan intact.